Sigmund Freud forever changed how we understand the human mind. Born in 1856 in Austria, he developed theories that still influence psychology, literature and culture today. His ideas were revolutionary because he argued that most of our mental life happens below conscious awareness. Through studying patients with mysterious symptoms, Freud discovered that the mind contains hidden forces that drive our behavior in ways we never realize. Part 1. The Unconscious Mind. Freud's most fundamental and revolutionary discovery was the unconscious mind. Before Freud, most philosophers and early psychologists believed that consciousness represented the entirety of mental life. They thought that if something was not in immediate awareness, it simply did not exist psychologically. Freud completely overturned this assumption through his clinical work with patients suffering from hysteria and other mysterious ailments. The breakthrough came when Freud observed patients under hypnosis. These individuals could recall traumatic memories that were completely absent from their normal conscious awareness. Even more striking, when these hidden memories were brought to light, physical symptoms often disappeared dramatically. A woman who had been paralyzed for years might suddenly regain the use of her limbs. This suggested that powerful psychological forces were operating completely outside conscious awareness. Freud realized he had discovered an entirely new realm of human experience. Freud divided human consciousness into 3 distinct levels, each with different characteristics and functions. The conscious mind contains everything we are immediately aware of at any given moment. This includes our current thoughts, feelings, sensations and perceptions. When you notice the temperature of the room or remember what you had for breakfast, that information exists in conscious awareness. The conscious mind represents only a tiny fraction of total mental activity. Freud estimated it comprised less than 10% of psychological life. The preconscious mind holds memories and thoughts that are not currently in awareness but can easily be brought to consciousness. If someone asks you the name of your first-grade teacher, you might need to think for a moment. That information was stored in your preconscious mind until the question brought it into conscious awareness. The preconscious serves as a kind of mental filing system. It contains vast amounts of information that we have learned throughout our lives. Skills like riding a bicycle or speaking our native language exist largely in preconscious memory. We can access this information when needed, but it does not crowd our immediate awareness. The preconscious mind also contains thoughts and feelings that we could become aware of if we chose to focus on them. The unconscious mind contains the vast majority of mental content. Freud believed this realm held repressed memories, forbidden desires, primitive instincts, and traumatic experiences. Unlike preconscious material, unconscious content cannot be brought to awareness simply by trying to remember it. Powerful psychological forces actively keep this material hidden from consciousness. The unconscious operates according to different rules than conscious thought. It knows no logic, recognizes no contradictions, and ignores the passage of time. Events from early childhood exist alongside recent experiences in the unconscious mind. Wishes and fears that should contradict each other coexist peacefully in this hidden realm. Freud used the famous iceberg metaphor to illustrate these different levels of consciousness. The tiny tip of an iceberg visible above water represents conscious awareness. The small section just below the surface represents preconscious material. The massive bulk of ice hidden deep underwater represents the unconscious mind. Just as the underwater portion of an iceberg determines its movement and stability, the unconscious mind shapes our thoughts, emotions and behavior in profound ways. We might feel anxious without knowing why, be attracted to certain people for mysterious reasons, or react strongly to seemingly minor events. According to Freud, the unconscious mind holds the explanations for these puzzling experiences. Our hidden psychological conflicts and repressed memories continue to influence us throughout our lives. The unconscious mind contains several different types of mental content. Repressed memories represent traumatic or painful experiences that were too overwhelming to remain in conscious awareness. A child who witnessed a terrible accident might completely forget the event, but the memory continues to influence their behavior from the unconscious mind. They might develop an inexplicable fear of cars, or feel anxious in certain locations without understanding why. Forbidden desires also reside in the unconscious mind. Society teaches us that certain thoughts and impulses are unacceptable. Rather than experience the anxiety and guilt these desires would create, the mind banishes them to unconscious regions. Sexual and aggressive impulses that conflict with moral teachings often undergo this process of repression. The unconscious mind also contains what Freud called primary process thinking. This primitive form of mental activity operates according to the pleasure principle. It seeks immediate gratification of desires without considering consequences or reality constraints. Primary process thinking uses symbols, images, and emotional associations rather than logical reasoning. When we dream, our minds engage in primary process thinking. Dream images often combine multiple meanings and ignore normal rules of time and space. A single dream figure might represent several different people from our lives. Events from childhood and recent experiences might blend together in impossible ways. Freud argued that unconscious mental activity follows the pleasure principle exclusively. This means it constantly seeks gratification and avoids pain without regard for practical considerations. If we were governed entirely by unconscious impulses, we would act like infants demanding immediate satisfaction of every desire. The conscious and preconscious minds operate according to the reality principle. They consider practical consequences, social expectations, and long-term goals when making decisions. The ongoing tension between pleasure-seeking unconscious impulses and reality-based conscious thinking creates much of human psychological conflict. The unconscious mind reveals itself through various phenomena that Freud studied extensively. Dreams provide the most direct access to unconscious content. During sleep, our psychological defenses weaken, allowing repressed material to surface in symbolic form. Slips of the tongue, now called Freudian slips, also reveal unconscious thoughts. When someone accidentally says something embarrassing or inappropriate, Freud believed this represented an unconscious desire breaking through conscious censorship. Jokes and humor often express forbidden thoughts in socially acceptable ways. We can say things through humor that would be shocking if expressed directly. Free association, where patients say whatever comes to mind, bypasses conscious control and reveals unconscious connections between ideas. Freud's discovery of the unconscious mind had revolutionary implications for understanding human nature. It suggested that people are not rational actors who make conscious decisions based on clear reasoning. Instead, we are driven by hidden forces that we neither understand nor control. Our sense of being unified, coherent individuals is largely an illusion. Multiple psychological systems with different goals and operating principles exist within each person. Sometimes these systems work together harmoniously, but often they conflict dramatically. Mental illness results when these conflicts become too intense for the conscious mind to manage effectively. Understanding the unconscious mind became essential for helping people overcome psychological problems and achieve greater self-awareness. Part 2. Dreams and Dream Analysis. Freud called dreams the royal road to the unconscious, and dream interpretation became the cornerstone of psychoanalytic practice. He believed that during sleep our psychological defenses weakened significantly, allowing unconscious wishes and conflicts to surface in disguised form. This discovery emerged from Freud's own self-analysis, particularly his famous dream about Irma's injection. Through analyzing this dream in extraordinary detail, Freud realized that dreams contain both obvious surface content and hidden psychological meaning. Every dream contains what Freud called manifest content and latent content. Manifest content represents what we actually remember upon waking. This includes the specific images, people, places, and events that occurred in the dream narrative. Latent content represents the hidden psychological meaning that the unconscious mind is trying to express. The relationship between manifest and latent content follows predictable patterns that Freud spent decades studying. Dreams serve as wish fulfillments, allowing us to experience forbidden desires in a safe, symbolic form. The process that transforms latent dream thoughts into manifest dream content is called dream work. Freud identified several mechanisms through which this transformation occurs. Condensation combines multiple ideas, people, or emotions into single dream elements. A dream figure might simultaneously represent your father, your boss, and your childhood teacher, all rolled into one person. This allows the unconscious mind to express complex relationships and conflicts efficiently. Displacement shifts emotional intensity from important elements to seemingly trivial ones. You might dream about losing your keys when you are actually anxious about losing your job. The emotional charge gets displaced from the threatening topic to something safer. Symbolization represents another crucial aspect of dream work. The unconscious mind transforms abstract concepts and forbidden impulses into concrete visual symbols. Freud developed an extensive catalogue of common dream symbols and their typical meanings. Long objects like sticks, umbrellas, or pencils often represent the male sexual organ. Enclosed spaces, like rooms, boxes, or vehicles, frequently symbolize the female sexual organ. Flying dreams might represent sexual desire or the wish for freedom from earthly constraints. Water often symbolizes birth, the womb, or emotional cleansing. Being chaste typically represents avoiding some uncomfortable truth about ourselves. Losing teeth might symbolize castration, anxiety, or fear of aging and death. However, Freud warned against mechanical symbol interpretation, emphasizing that personal associations matter more than universal meanings. Secondary revision occurs when we try to remember and tell our dreams. The conscious mind attempts to create a coherent narrative from fragmented dream images. This process often adds logical connections that were not present in the actual dream experience. We might remember a dream as having a clear beginning, middle, and end when the actual dream was chaotic and disjointed. Secondary revision can distort the original dream meaning, which is why Freud encouraged patients to report their dreams immediately upon waking. Fresh dream memories retain more of their original symbolic content before conscious editing takes place. Freud distinguished between several different types of dreams. Wish fulfillment dreams directly satisfy unconscious desires in symbolic form. A hungry person might dream of eating a delicious meal, or someone who feels powerless might dream of achieving great success. Anxiety dreams appear to contradict the wish fulfillment theory because they cause distress rather than pleasure. However, Freud argued that these dreams actually fulfill the wish to be punished for forbidden desires. The superego creates anxiety dreams to express moral condemnation of unconscious impulses. Traumatic dreams repeat painful experiences compulsively. These dreams initially puzzled Freud because they seemed to violate the pleasure principle. Later, he explained them through his theory of the death drive and repetition compulsion. The mind attempts to master overwhelming experiences by repeating them in dream form. Children's dreams provided crucial evidence for Freud's wish fulfillment theory. Young children often have simple, direct dreams that clearly express their desires. A child who was denied candy might dream of eating unlimited sweets. As people mature, their dreams become more complex and symbolic because social conditioning creates stronger censorship of forbidden wishes. Adult dreams require sophisticated interpretation to uncover their latent meaning. The same psychological forces that create neurotic symptoms also shape dream content. Both dreams and symptoms represent compromises between unconscious desires and conscious moral standards. This connection made dream analysis an essential tool for understanding psychological problems. Freud developed specific techniques for interpreting dreams in therapeutic settings. Free association became the primary method for uncovering latent dream content. Patients would focus on individual dream elements and say whatever came to mind without censoring their thoughts. These associations often revealed personal meanings that differed from standard symbol interpretations. The emotional tone of associations provided important clues about psychological significance. Strong emotional reactions to seemingly minor dream details often indicated important unconscious conflicts. Resistance during dream analysis revealed areas where psychological defenses were particularly strong. When patients could not associate to certain dream elements or became uncomfortable discussing them, this suggested proximity to repressed material. The interpretation of dreams also revealed important information about the dreamer's psychological development and current conflicts. Recurring dreams often pointed to unresolved issues from childhood that continued to influence adult behavior. The people who appeared in dreams typically represented significant figures from the dreamer's past or present. The relationships between dream characters reflected the dreamer's internal psychological dynamics. Dream settings frequently symbolized different aspects of the self or important life situations. The emotions experienced in dreams provided direct access to feelings that might be repressed during waking hours. Freud's dream theory had profound implications for understanding human psychology. It demonstrated that mental activity continues during sleep and follows different rules than conscious thought. Dreams proved that the unconscious mind actively processes experiences and emotions outside of awareness. The symbolic nature of dream content showed that the mind naturally thinks in metaphors and associations rather than logical sequences. Dream analysis became a powerful tool for accessing repressed memories and unconscious conflicts. Through understanding their dreams, people could gain insight into their deepest motivations and fears. This knowledge provided the foundation for psychological healing and personal growth. Dreams revealed the hidden connections between seemingly unrelated experiences and emotions in ways that conscious reflection could never achieve. Part 3. The structural model of mind. Freud's structural model divided personality into three interacting systems called ID, ego, and superego. This tripartite model emerged later in his career as he refined his understanding of psychological conflict. These three parts constantly struggle for control over our thoughts, feelings, and behavior. Understanding this internal conflict helps explain why people often feel torn between different desires and why psychological symptoms develop. Mental health depends on achieving dynamic balance between these competing forces rather than allowing any single system to dominate completely. Each system operates according to different principles and serves distinct psychological functions. The ID represents the most primitive and fundamental aspect of personality. It contains all our basic biological drives, including hunger, thirst, sex, and aggression. Freud believed the ID operates entirely on the pleasure principle, seeking immediate gratification of desires without considering consequences or reality constraints. The ID exists completely in the unconscious mind and has no contact with the external world. It knows no logic, recognizes no contradictions, and ignores moral considerations entirely. When you feel sudden hunger, sexual attraction, or aggressive impulses, these represent ID forces breaking into consciousness. The ID thinks in primary process using images, symbols, and wish fulfillment rather than rational thought. It wants what it wants when it wants it, regardless of practicality or appropriateness. The ID contains what Freud called the libido, the fundamental life energy that drives all psychological activity. Originally, he thought libido was purely sexual energy, but later expanded this concept to include all life-preserving and pleasure-seeking impulses. The ID also houses aggressive drives that seek to destroy, dominate, or harm others. These destructive impulses balance the creative forces of libido in complex ways. Without the ID, humans would lack motivation to eat, reproduce, defend themselves, or pursue any pleasurable activities. However, if the ID operated without restraint, people would act like infants demanding immediate satisfaction of every impulse. Society could not function if everyone followed pure ID demands without consideration for others or consequences. The ID provides essential psychological energy, but requires regulation by other personality systems. The ego serves as the rational executive that mediates between ID impulses and external reality. It operates according to the reality principle, considering practical consequences and environmental constraints when making decisions. The ego develops during the first few years of life as children learn to delay gratification and adapt to social expectations. Unlike the ID, which exists entirely in the unconscious, the ego operates across all three levels of consciousness. It uses logical thinking, memory, perception, and problem-solving skills to navigate daily life effectively. The ego attempts to find realistic ways to satisfy ID impulses while avoiding negative consequences. When you feel hungry, your ego helps you locate food, prepare a meal, or wait until an appropriate time to eat. It considers factors like time, location, social appropriateness, and available resources. The ego employs secondary process thinking, which follows logical rules and considers temporal sequences. It can delay gratification when immediate satisfaction would create problems. The ego also maintains contact with external reality through the senses and adjusts behavior based on feedback from the environment. It learns from experience and develops increasingly sophisticated strategies for meeting psychological needs. A strong ego can tolerate frustration, manage conflicting demands, and maintain stable functioning under stress. When the ego becomes overwhelmed by competing pressures from the ID, superego, and external world, psychological symptoms may develop. Anxiety often signals that the ego feels unable to manage these conflicting demands effectively. Depression might result when the ego feels helpless to achieve important goals or satisfy basic needs. The superego represents our moral conscience and contains the values, ideals and standards we learned from parents and society. It develops during the phallic stage of psychosexual development when children resolve their Oedipal conflicts by identifying with their same-sex parent. The superego has two main components that serve different moral functions. The conscience creates feelings of guilt and anxiety when we violate moral standards or consider forbidden actions. It punishes us psychologically for actual or contemplated wrongdoing. The ego ideal generates feelings of pride and satisfaction when we live up to high moral standards and achieve worthy goals. It rewards us for virtuous behavior and noble aspirations. Together, these systems create an internal moral guidance system that influences behavior even when external authorities are absent. The superego can become either too harsh or too lenient, creating different types of psychological problems. An overly strict superego generates neurotic guilt, perfectionism, and self-punishment that interferes with normal functioning. People with harsh superegos might feel guilty about natural impulses or set impossibly high standards for themselves. They may become paralyzed by moral anxiety and unable to enjoy life's legitimate pleasures. Conversely, a weak or underdeveloped superego allows antisocial behavior and lack of moral restraint. People with deficient superegos might lie, steal, or harm others without experiencing appropriate guilt. They lack internal moral guidance and depend entirely on external consequences to control their behavior. Healthy psychological development requires a superego that provides moral guidance without being excessively punitive. The dynamic interactions between ID, ego, and superego create the complexity of human personality. These systems rarely agree completely about what actions to take in any given situation. The ID might demand immediate sexual gratification, while the superego condemns such desires as immoral. The ego must find compromises that partially satisfy both systems while remaining realistic about external constraints. These internal negotiations occur largely outside conscious awareness, but influence our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors continuously. When conflicts become too intense, the ego employs defense mechanisms to reduce anxiety and maintain psychological equilibrium. Sometimes these defenses create symptoms or behavioral problems that seem puzzling without understanding the underlying structural conflicts. Successful psychoanalytic treatment aims to strengthen the ego so it can manage these competing demands more effectively. Different personality types emerge depending on which system dominates psychological functioning. People with strong ID influence tend to be impulsive, pleasure-seeking, and emotionally expressive. They might have difficulty delaying gratification or considering long-term consequences of their actions. Those dominated by super-ego influence become overly controlled, moralistic, and self-critical. They might struggle with guilt, perfectionism, and inability to enjoy life's pleasures. Individuals with strong ego development achieve better balance between impulse and restraint. They can satisfy their needs while respecting moral standards and practical limitations. The goal of psychological development is not to eliminate any system, but to achieve harmonious cooperation between all three components. Freud's structural model provided a framework for understanding psychological conflict and mental illness. Neurotic symptoms often represent unsuccessful attempts to resolve conflicts between competing psychological systems. Anxiety disorders might result from ego weakness in managing ID impulses or superego demands. Depression could emerge when the superego attacks the ego for perceived failures or moral shortcomings. Understanding these structural dynamics became essential for effective psychoanalytic treatment. Therapists could help patients recognize their internal conflicts and develop healthier ways of managing competing psychological demands. This structural approach revolutionized understanding of human motivation and psychological development. It showed that personality emerges from ongoing negotiations between different aspects of the self, rather than representing a unified, rational decision-maker. Part 4. Psychosexual development stages. Freud proposed that personality develops through 5 distinct psychosexual stages during childhood and adolescence. Each stage focuses on a different erogenous zone where pleasure and psychological conflict occur. The way children navigate these stages determines their adult personality characteristics, relationship patterns, and potential psychological problems. Freud shocked Victorian society by suggesting that children have sexual impulses from birth, though he used sexuality in a broader sense than adult genital sexuality. These developmental stages represent universal patterns that all humans experience, though individual variations occur based on parenting styles and environmental factors. Problems during any stage can create fixations that influence behavior throughout life. The oral stage occurs from birth to approximately 18 months of age. During this period, the mouth serves as the primary source of pleasure and the main way infants interact with their environment. Babies derive satisfaction from sucking, biting, chewing, and oral exploration of objects. The mouth also provides the first relationship experience through nursing and feeding interactions with caregivers. How parents respond to the infant's oral needs significantly influences personality development. Consistent, nurturing feeding experiences create basic trust and security that forms the foundation for healthy relationships. Inconsistent or harsh feeding practices can create anxiety and dependency that persists into adulthood. The infant learns whether the world is a safe, satisfying place or a source of frustration and deprivation. Oral fixation can manifest in 2 different patterns, depending on the specific nature of early feeding experiences. Oral receptive personalities develop when children receive too much oral gratification or have their needs met too readily. These individuals become overly dependent on others for satisfaction and support throughout their lives. They might become gullible, passive, and always seeking care from other people. Oral aggressive personalities emerge when children experience frustration or weaning that occurs too early or harshly. These individuals develop aggressive, dominating approaches to getting their needs met. They might become argumentative, sarcastic, or verbally aggressive. Both types of oral fixation can lead to problems with eating, drinking, smoking, or other oral behaviors in adulthood. People with oral fixations might also struggle with dependency issues in relationships or have difficulty being alone. They may seek oral substitutes like gum chewing, nail biting, or excessive talking when feeling anxious or frustrated. The anal stage spans from approximately 18 months to 3 years of age. During this period, children learn toilet training and develop control over their bodily functions. The anus becomes the primary erogenous zone, as children discover they can experience pleasure from retaining or releasing feces. More importantly, toilet training represents the first major confrontation between the child's impulses and social expectations. Parents demand that children control their natural bodily functions according to social rules and timing. How this conflict gets resolved significantly influences the child's relationship to authority, control, and personal autonomy. Children must learn to delay gratification and conform to external demands while maintaining some sense of personal agency. The anal stage establishes patterns for dealing with rules, organization, and power struggles that persist throughout life. Anal fixation creates two distinct personality types based on how toilet training was handled. Anal retentive personalities develop when parents are too strict, harsh, or demanding during toilet training. These individuals become obsessively neat, orderly, and controlling in their adult lives. They might be extremely punctual, frugal, and concerned with cleanliness and organization. Anal retentive people often struggle with perfectionism and have difficulty being spontaneous or flexible. They may become anxious when their environment feels chaotic or unpredictable. Anal expulsive personalities emerge when parents are too lenient or permissive during toilet training. These individuals become careless, messy, and disorganized in their approach to life. They might be chronically late, sloppy in their appearance, and irresponsible with money or commitments. Both anal personality types struggle with issues of control, but express this struggle in opposite ways. The phallic stage occurs between approximately 3 and 6 years of age. During this period, children become aware of anatomical differences between males and females and develop curiosity about their own sexual identity. The genitals become the primary erogenous zone as children discover that touching these areas produces pleasurable sensations. More significantly, children develop romantic and sexual feelings toward their opposite-sex parent while feeling rivalry and jealousy toward their same-sex parent. This creates the famous Oedipus complex in boys and Electra complex in girls that represents the most crucial developmental challenge of early childhood. How children resolve these conflicts determines their gender identity, moral development, and future relationship patterns. The phallic stage establishes the foundation for the superego through identification with the same-sex parent. Children internalize parental values and moral standards as a way of resolving their competitive feelings. Successful resolution of phallic stage conflicts leads to healthy gender identity and appropriate moral development. Boys learn to identify with their fathers and develop masculine characteristics, while girls identify with their mothers and develop feminine traits. Children also internalize moral standards and develop the capacity for guilt and moral reasoning. Unsuccessful resolution can create various psychological problems, including gender identity confusion, difficulty with authority figures, and problems forming intimate relationships. Some individuals might remain psychologically attached to their opposite-sex parent and have trouble forming mature romantic relationships. Others might develop excessive guilt or anxiety about sexual feelings and desires. The phallic stage also introduces children to themes of competition, jealousy, and rivalry that influence their social relationships throughout life. Learning to manage these intense emotions constructively becomes essential for psychological health. The latency stage extends from approximately 6 years of age until the onset of puberty. During this period, sexual feelings become dormant while children focus their energy on developing intellectual and social skills. This represents a relatively calm phase of development where children can concentrate on school, friendships, and mastering various competencies. The repression of sexual impulses allows children to form same-sex friendships and develop interests in sports, hobbies, and academic subjects. However, Freud believed that sexual impulses do not disappear entirely, but are redirected into socially acceptable activities through the process of sublimation. Children might become intensely interested in collecting objects, mastering games, or achieving academic success. The latency stage provides an opportunity for ego development and the consolidation of earlier psychosexual achievements. Children can practice social skills and develop confidence in their abilities without the intense emotional conflicts of earlier stages. The genital stage begins at puberty and continues throughout adulthood. With the onset of adolescence, sexual impulses re-emerge with new intensity and focus on the genitals as the primary erogenous zone. However, unlike earlier stages where sexuality was primarily self-focused, genital stage sexuality involves genuine concern for the pleasure and well-being of others. Adolescents and adults develop the capacity for mature love that combines sexual attraction with emotional intimacy and mutual care. This represents the highest level of psychosexual development, where individuals can form lasting, satisfying relationships. Successful navigation of earlier stages provides the foundation for healthy adult sexuality and emotional maturity. People who have unresolved conflicts from earlier stages may struggle with various aspects of adult relationships and sexuality. The genital stage represents the goal of psychosexual development, where all the earlier achievements come together in mature, productive functioning. Freud's theory of psychosexual development had profound implications for understanding personality formation and psychological problems. It suggested that early childhood experiences have lasting effects on adult behavior and personality characteristics. The specific ways parents handle feeding, toilet training, and sexual curiosity can create lifelong patterns of behavior. This developmental perspective helped explain why some psychological problems seem to emerge from nowhere in adulthood. Often, these symptoms represent unresolved conflicts from much earlier developmental stages. Understanding psychosexual development became essential for effective psychoanalytic treatment because it provided a roadmap for exploring early childhood experiences. Therapists could help patients identify fixations and work through unresolved developmental conflicts. This developmental framework also emphasized the importance of early parenting practices and their long-term consequences for children's psychological health. Part 5. The Oedipus and Electra complexes. The Oedipus complex represents Freud's most controversial and influential theory about childhood development. Named after the Greek myth where Oedipus unknowingly kills his father and marries his mother, this concept describes universal psychological conflicts that all children experience between ages 3 and 6. Freud believed that during the phallic stage, boys develop intense romantic and sexual feelings toward their mothers while simultaneously feeling jealousy and murderous rage toward their fathers. This creates an impossible psychological situation that children must resolve to achieve healthy development. The Oedipus complex represents the most crucial developmental challenge because its resolution determines gender identity, moral development, and the capacity for mature relationships. Although shocking to Victorian society, Freud considered this theory essential for understanding human psychology and civilization itself. The development of the Oedipus complex follows a predictable pattern in boys. Young children initially love both parents equally and compete with siblings for parental attention and affection. However, as boys become aware of anatomical differences between males and females, they begin to feel special attraction to their mothers. The mother represents the first love object for children of both sexes because she typically provides primary care during infancy. Boys begin to fantasize about having exclusive possession of their mothers and eliminating their fathers as competitors. These feelings intensify as boys notice the intimate relationship between their parents and feel excluded from this special bond. They might express desires to marry their mothers or announce that they will take their father's place when they grow up. However, these innocent expressions mask deeper psychological conflicts that create significant anxiety. The father becomes the primary rival and obstacle to the boy's desires. Boys begin to view their fathers with ambivalent feelings that combine love, admiration, fear, and murderous hatred. They love their fathers as providers and protectors, but hate them as competitors for maternal affection. This creates intense psychological conflict because children also depend on their fathers for safety and approval. Boys might have aggressive fantasies about defeating or eliminating their fathers, while simultaneously fearing retaliation for these forbidden thoughts. The father represents a powerful rival who seems impossible to overcome through direct competition. Children begin to fear that their fathers know about their competitive feelings and might punish them severely. This fear becomes focused on the possibility of castration as the ultimate punishment for sexual desires toward the mother. Castration anxiety represents the crucial emotional force that motivates resolution of the Oedipus complex. Boys notice that girls lack penises and conclude that they must have been castrated as punishment for similar forbidden desires. This discovery creates terror that the same fate might befall them if they continue pursuing their mothers sexually. The father is imagined as the agent of this potential punishment because he has the power and authority to enforce sexual rules. Castration anxiety becomes so overwhelming that boys are motivated to renounce their sexual desires for their mothers entirely. However, simply giving up these desires would create unbearable feelings of loss and defeat. Instead, boys resolve the conflict through identification with their fathers. If they cannot beat their fathers, they decide to join them by becoming like them. Identification with the father serves multiple psychological functions that resolve the Oedipal conflict. Boys internalize their father's values, attitudes, and moral standards, creating the foundation for the superego. They adopt masculine behaviors and gender roles that help them develop appropriate sexual identity. Through identification, boys gain vicarious satisfaction by imagining that they share in their father's relationship with their mothers. They also develop the promise that someday they will find their own wives who will provide the love they cannot have from their mothers. This resolution requires boys to accept delayed gratification and renounce immediate wishes for future possibilities. The process establishes respect for authority, moral conscience, and the capacity to form appropriate heterosexual relationships in adulthood. Boys who successfully resolve their Oedipus complex develop healthy masculine identity and moral development. The Electra complex describes a parallel process in girls, though Freud devoted less attention to female psychological development. Girls initially feel close attachment to their mothers, but discover during the phallic stage that they lack penises. This discovery creates what Freud called penis envy, a feeling of anatomical inferiority and resentment toward their mothers for bringing them into the world incomplete. Girls blame their mothers for their perceived castration and turn toward their fathers as love objects. They fantasize about receiving a penis from their fathers or having babies with them as compensation for their anatomical deficit. However, girls must compete with their mothers for paternal affection, creating rivalry and conflict similar to the male Oedipus complex. The resolution occurs through identification with their mothers and acceptance of feminine gender roles. Girls learn to find satisfaction through future relationships with men who can provide the masculine qualities they lack. Freud believed that girls face greater difficulty resolving their Electra complex because they lack the intense castration anxiety that motivates boys to identification. Since girls are already castrated, they do not fear the same punishment for their forbidden desires. This creates less pressure to renounce their attachment to their fathers and identify with their mothers. Freud suggested that women consequently develop weaker superegos and less rigid moral standards than men. He also believed that penis envy persists throughout female development and influences women's relationships with men and their own sexuality. These aspects of Freud's theory have been heavily criticized by feminist scholars and modern psychologists who reject the assumption of female inferiority. However, the basic insight about children's complex feelings toward parents and the importance of identification processes remains influential. Many contemporary theorists have reinterpreted these concepts in terms of power dynamics and social learning rather than anatomical differences. Successful resolution of Oedipal conflicts produces several important developmental achievements. Children develop appropriate gender identity and sexual orientation through identification with their same-sex parent. They internalize moral standards and develop the capacity for guilt, shame, and moral reasoning. The superego emerges as an internal moral authority that guides behavior even when external supervision is absent. Children learn to delay gratification and accept that they cannot have everything they want immediately. They develop respect for authority figures and social rules that enables them to function in civilized society. Most importantly, children learn to channel their sexual and aggressive impulses into socially acceptable activities through sublimation. These achievements provide the foundation for healthy psychological development and the capacity to form mature, intimate relationships in adulthood. Unsuccessful resolution of the Oedipus complex can create various psychological problems that persist throughout life. Some individuals remain psychologically attached to their opposite-sex parent and have difficulty forming intimate relationships with peers. They might constantly seek partners who resemble their parent, or feel that no one can measure up to their idealized parental relationship. Others develop excessive guilt or anxiety about sexual feelings and desires because they never fully resolve their childhood conflicts. Problems with authority figures often trace back to unresolved competitive feelings toward the same-sex parent. Some people continue to rebel against authority, while others become overly submissive and dependent. Gender identity confusion can result when identification processes are disrupted, or when parents provide poor role models. Understanding these potential complications became essential for psychoanalytic treatment of adult psychological problems. The Oedipus complex also had broader implications for Freud's understanding of civilization and culture. He believed that the renunciation of incestuous desires represents the foundation of all moral and social development. The incest taboo forces children to look outside their families for sexual partners, creating the basis for social cooperation and cultural exchange. The internalization of paternal authority through superego development enables the transmission of moral values across generations. Sublimation of sexual and aggressive impulses provides the psychological energy for artistic, intellectual, and technological achievements. Without the Oedipus complex, Freud argued, human civilization could not exist because people would lack moral restraint and social cooperation. This connection between individual psychological development and broader cultural processes became a central theme in Freud's later social and anthropological writings. The Oedipus complex thus represents not just a personal developmental challenge, but the psychological foundation of human society itself. Part 6. Defense mechanisms. When the ego cannot successfully resolve conflicts between ID impulses, superego demands, and external reality, it employs defense mechanisms to protect consciousness from overwhelming anxiety. These unconscious psychological strategies distort reality or redirect emotional energy to maintain psychological equilibrium. Defense mechanisms operate automatically without conscious awareness and serve an important protective function by preventing psychological breakdown. However, overuse of defensive strategies can create psychological problems and interfere with effective functioning. Freud identified numerous defense mechanisms that people use to cope with internal conflicts and external stresses. Understanding these defensive processes became essential for psychoanalytic treatment because symptoms often represent unsuccessful attempts at psychological protection. Repression represents the most fundamental defense mechanism and forms the foundation for all others. This process actively pushes painful memories, traumatic experiences, and forbidden impulses into the unconscious mind where they cannot cause immediate distress. Repression differs from simple forgetting because it involves active psychological work to keep disturbing material out of consciousness. The repressed content does not disappear but continues to influence behavior from the unconscious level. People might completely forget traumatic childhood experiences, yet continue to feel anxious in situations that remind them of the original trauma. Repression protects consciousness from overwhelming pain, but prevents psychological integration and healing. The energy required to maintain repression can drain psychological resources and create various symptoms. Psychoanalytic treatment aims to help patients safely recall and process repressed material to achieve greater psychological integration. Denial involves refusing to acknowledge obvious reality when it conflicts with psychological needs or desires. Unlike repression, which operates on internal psychological content, denial distorts perception of external reality. Someone might deny they have a serious medical condition, despite clear diagnostic evidence. Parents might refuse to believe their child has behavioral problems, even when teachers and other authorities provide consistent feedback. Denial serves a protective function by preventing overwhelming anxiety about situations that feel beyond personal control. However, persistent denial interferes with problem-solving and adaptive behavior. People who rely heavily on denial might fail to seek necessary medical treatment or address serious relationship problems. The temporary protection denial provides often comes at the cost of long-term consequences that become increasingly difficult to ignore. Projection attributes personal feelings, thoughts, or impulses to other people rather than acknowledging them as originating within oneself. A person who feels angry might accuse others of being hostile toward them. Someone struggling with sexual impulses might see sexual intentions in other people's innocent behavior. Projection allows people to experience forbidden feelings while maintaining the illusion that these feelings belong to someone else. This defense mechanism often creates interpersonal problems because projected feelings distort perception of other people's actual motivations. Relationships become difficult when one person consistently misinterprets the other's behavior based on their own projected conflicts. Paranoid thinking often involves extensive use of projection, where personal, aggressive or persecutory feelings are attributed to external enemies. Helping patients recognize their projections becomes an important aspect of psychoanalytic treatment. Displacement redirects emotional energy from threatening targets toward safer ones. Someone who feels angry at their boss might come home and yell at their family members instead. A child who cannot express anger toward their parents might become aggressive toward siblings or pets. Displacement allows emotional expression while avoiding the consequences that would result from directing feelings toward their original target. This defense mechanism often creates problems because innocent people receive emotional reactions that rightfully belong elsewhere. Family relationships frequently suffer when work stress gets displaced into domestic conflicts. Understanding displacement patterns can help people recognize the true sources of their emotional reactions and address problems more directly. Displacement also operates in phobic disorders where anxiety about internal conflicts gets redirected towards specific external objects or situations. Sublimation represents the healthiest defense mechanism because it channels primitive impulses into socially valuable activities. Aggressive drives might become channeled into competitive sports, military service, or aggressive business practices. Sexual energy might fuel artistic creativity, scientific research, or humanitarian activities. Unlike other defense mechanisms that simply avoid or distort reality, sublimation allows partial satisfaction of basic drives while contributing to individual and social well-being. Freud believed that sublimation provides the psychological energy for civilization's greatest achievements in art, science, and culture. People who successfully sublimate their primitive impulses often become highly productive and creative individuals. However, sublimation requires sufficient ego strength to redirect powerful impulses without losing contact with their underlying emotional energy. Excessive sublimation can create overly intellectualized or emotionally distant personalities that lack spontaneity and passion. Rationalization creates logical explanations for irrational behavior or unacceptable impulses. People convince themselves that selfish actions serve noble purposes or that harmful behavior was justified by circumstances. A student who fails an exam might blame the teacher's unfair questions rather than acknowledge inadequate preparation. Someone who treats others badly might rationalize their behavior as necessary toughness or honesty. Rationalization allows people to maintain positive self-images while engaging in behavior that contradicts their stated values. This defense mechanism often involves sophisticated intellectual arguments that sound convincing but miss the underlying emotional truth. Excessive rationalization can create rigid, intellectualized personalities that lose touch with genuine feelings and motivations. Effective therapy often involves helping patients recognize the difference between rational explanations and emotional rationalization. Regression involves returning to earlier developmental stages when facing overwhelming stress or anxiety. Adults might become childlike in their behavior, seeking comfort and care from others when feeling frightened or overwhelmed. Someone facing a serious illness might become dependent and demanding like a young child. Students under academic pressure might engage in behaviors reminiscent of earlier developmental periods. Regression serves a protective function by returning to psychological strategies that provided comfort and security in the past. However, regressive behavior often interferes with adult responsibilities and relationships. Temporary regression during crises can be adaptive if it allows people to gather strength for coping with challenges. Persistent regression becomes problematic when it prevents psychological growth and effective problem-solving. Reaction formation involves adopting attitudes and behaviors that are directly opposite to underlying unconscious impulses. Someone who feels powerful aggressive impulses might become excessively gentle and pacifistic. A person struggling with sexual desires might become prudish and morally righteous about sexuality. Parents who feel ambivalent about their children might become overprotective and intrusive. Reaction formation allows people to control threatening impulses by moving as far as possible in the opposite direction. However, these extreme positions often feel rigid and forced because they require constant psychological effort to maintain. People using reaction formation might become judgmental toward others who openly express the impulses they are defending against. The underlying impulses occasionally break through the defensive facade, creating inconsistent or hypocritical behavior patterns. Isolation of affect separates thoughts from their associated emotions, allowing people to discuss traumatic experiences without feeling the appropriate emotional responses. Someone might describe childhood abuse in a detached, intellectual manner without experiencing anger, sadness, or fear. This defense mechanism protects consciousness from overwhelming emotions while permitting some degree of psychological processing. Isolation often develops in response to repeated trauma, where emotional responses became too painful to tolerate. While this defense provides temporary protection, it interferes with emotional healing and interpersonal relationships. People who rely heavily on isolation might seem cold or disconnected, even when discussing important personal experiences. Effective therapy often involves helping patients reconnect with their emotional responses to achieve more complete psychological integration. The goal is not to eliminate defensive strategies, but to use them more flexibly and appropriately. Understanding defense mechanisms became central to psychoanalytic technique because these unconscious strategies often maintain psychological symptoms. Patients typically resist recognizing their defensive patterns because acknowledging them would increase anxiety in the short term. Therapists must carefully interpret defensive behavior without attacking the patient's psychological protection too aggressively. The therapeutic relationship provides a safe environment where patients can gradually explore their defensive patterns and develop healthier coping strategies. Working through defense mechanisms often requires considerable time because they serve important protective functions that cannot simply be abandoned. Successful analysis helps patients develop stronger egos that can tolerate anxiety without relying so heavily on unconscious defensive distortions. The goal is to achieve greater psychological flexibility, where defensive strategies can be used consciously and appropriately rather than automatically and rigidly. This process of defensive modification represents one of the most important therapeutic changes in psychoanalytic treatment. Part 7. Repression and Return of the Repressed. Repression operates as the cornerstone of all psychological defense mechanisms and represents the fundamental process by which the mind protects itself from overwhelming anxiety. Unlike simple forgetting, repression involves active psychological work to keep disturbing thoughts, memories, and impulses out of conscious awareness. This process occurs automatically and unconsciously whenever material threatens to create unbearable emotional distress. Freud discovered repression through his clinical work with patients who had completely forgotten traumatic experiences, yet continued to suffer from mysterious physical and psychological symptoms. The energy required to maintain repression does not simply make problems disappear, but redirects psychological conflict into new forms of expression. Understanding repression became essential for psychoanalytic theory because it explains how unconscious conflicts continue to influence behavior despite being removed from conscious awareness. Repression typically begins during childhood, when young minds encounter experiences or impulses that feel too threatening to process consciously. A child who witnesses domestic violence might completely forget the traumatic events to preserve their psychological equilibrium. Sexual abuse victims often repress memories of their experiences because acknowledging them would create overwhelming feelings of helplessness and betrayal. Children might also repress their own aggressive or sexual impulses when these feelings conflict with parental expectations or moral teachings. The developing ego lacks the strength and sophistication to integrate extremely disturbing experiences, so repression serves as a necessary survival mechanism. However, repressed material does not remain static but continues to seek expression through various indirect pathways. The unconscious mind operates according to different rules than conscious thought, allowing repressed content to influence behavior in ways that bypass logical reasoning. Dreams, slips of the tongue, and seemingly random behaviors often provide clues about repressed psychological material. The process of repression involves several psychological mechanisms working together to exclude disturbing content from consciousness. Selective attention focuses awareness away from threatening stimuli, while selective memory avoids recalling painful experiences. Emotional numbing prevents feelings associated with traumatic events from reaching conscious awareness. Cognitive distortions reinterpret events in ways that minimize their threatening implications. The ego employs these various strategies to maintain the repressive barrier that separates conscious from unconscious mental content. However, maintaining repression requires constant psychological energy that could otherwise be used for creative and productive activities. People who rely heavily on repression often feel emotionally flat or experience chronic fatigue because so much mental energy goes toward keeping disturbing material unconscious. They might also develop physical symptoms as the body expresses emotional conflicts that cannot be acknowledged psychologically. The return of the repressed represents one of Freud's most important insights about how unconscious material eventually finds expression despite psychological censorship. Repressed content possesses a dynamic quality that constantly seeks outlets for expression, though these outlets might be disguised or symbolic rather than direct. Dreams provide the most common pathway for repressed material to surface because psychological defenses weaken during sleep. Traumatic memories might appear in nightmares or symbolic dream imagery that represents the original experience in disguised form. Slips of the tongue, now called Freudian slips, occur when repressed thoughts briefly break through conscious censorship. Someone might accidentally call their spouse by their ex-lover's name, revealing unconscious feelings they would never admit consciously. Parapraxes, or faulty actions like forgetting important appointments or losing valuable objects, often express repressed hostility or ambivalence. These seemingly accidental behaviors allow unconscious impulses to achieve partial satisfaction while maintaining the illusion of conscious control. Psychological symptoms frequently represent the return of repressed material in disguised form. Conversion hysteria, creates physical symptoms that symbolically express repressed emotional conflicts without bringing the underlying issues into conscious awareness. A woman who repressed anger toward her husband might develop paralysis in her hand, preventing her from striking him while expressing her aggressive impulses symbolically. Phobic disorders often involve displacement of repressed fears onto specific objects or situations that feel safer than confronting the original source of anxiety. Someone who repressed memories of childhood sexual abuse might develop a phobia of enclosed spaces that symbolically represents their trapped feelings during the original trauma. Obsessive-compulsive behaviors might ritualize repressed impulses in socially acceptable ways. Compulsive hand-washing could express repressed guilt about sexual or aggressive activities without acknowledging the underlying emotional conflicts directly. These symptoms provide partial satisfaction of repressed impulses while maintaining psychological defense against conscious recognition. Repressed material also returns through repetition compulsions, where people unconsciously recreate traumatic experiences in new situations. Someone who was abandoned as a child might repeatedly choose partners who eventually reject them, recreating the original trauma without recognizing the pattern. Victims of childhood abuse might unconsciously gravitate toward abusive relationships that feel familiar despite being destructive. These repetitions serve multiple psychological functions, including attempts to master traumatic experiences and unconscious efforts to provoke the emotional responses that were repressed originally. The individual remains unaware of these patterns because recognizing them would require confronting the repressed experiences that motivated their development. Breaking repetition compulsions often requires therapeutic work to uncover and process the underlying repressed material. Until these unconscious patterns are recognized and worked through, people remain trapped in destructive cycles that recreate their original psychological wounds. Understanding repetition compulsions became essential for explaining why people sometimes sabotage their own happiness and success. Creative activities often provide socially valued outlets for the return of repressed material. Artists might express forbidden sexual or aggressive impulses through their work without recognizing the psychological origins of their inspiration. Writers frequently explore themes that relate to their own repressed conflicts while maintaining psychological distance through fictional characters and situations. Musicians might channel repressed emotions into compositions that move audiences without conscious awareness of their personal psychological content. This sublimated return of the repressed serves both individual and social functions by allowing partial expression of forbidden impulses while contributing to cultural development. Freud believed that much of civilization's greatest art and literature emerged from the creative transformation of repressed psychological material. However, even sublimated expressions cannot completely satisfy repressed impulses, which continue to seek more direct outlets for expression. The ongoing tension between repression and the return of repressed material provides the dynamic energy that drives much of human psychological life. The therapeutic process in psychoanalysis specifically aims to help patients safely recover and integrate repressed material. Free association encourages patients to say whatever comes to mind without conscious censorship, allowing repressed content to surface gradually. Dream analysis provides another pathway for exploring unconscious material that appears in symbolic form during sleep. Transference relationships in therapy often recreate repressed conflicts from early childhood, allowing patients to experience and work through these issues in a safe, therapeutic environment. However, the recovery of repressed material must proceed carefully, because premature confrontation with traumatic memories can be psychologically damaging. Patients need sufficient ego strength and therapeutic support to integrate disturbing material without becoming overwhelmed by anxiety or other symptoms. The goal is not simply to make unconscious material conscious, but to help patients develop healthier ways of managing psychological conflicts. Successful therapy often involves recognizing how repressed material continues to influence current behavior and relationships. Repression and the return of the repressed also have broader implications for understanding social and cultural phenomena. Freud believed that civilizations develop collective repressions of primitive impulses that enable social cooperation but create ongoing tensions. Societal taboos against violence and unbridled sexuality serve necessary functions but require constant psychological energy to maintain. The return of socially repressed material might occur through war, revolution, or other forms of collective violence when social controls break down. Cultural productions like literature, art, and entertainment often provide outlets for the expression of socially repressed impulses in symbolically acceptable forms. Understanding these dynamics helps explain both individual psychological symptoms and broader social movements that seem to emerge from nowhere. The concepts of repression and return of the repressed thus provide insights into both personal psychological development and the functioning of human societies. These ideas continue to influence contemporary psychology, sociology, and cultural analysis, even among theorists who reject other aspects of Freudian theory. Part 8. Free Association and Psychoanalytic Method. Free association became the fundamental technique of psychoanalytic treatment and represents Freud's most important contribution to therapeutic practice. This method emerged from his early experiments with hypnosis, when he discovered that patients could access unconscious material through relaxed, uncensored verbal expression. The basic rule of free association requires patients to say whatever comes to mind without editing, censoring, or organizing their thoughts logically. This seemingly simple instruction creates a unique psychological situation that bypasses normal conscious defenses and allows unconscious content to surface gradually. Freud believed that the mind naturally moves towards psychological truth when artificial constraints are removed, making free association the royal road to unconscious conflicts and repressed memories. The technique requires considerable skill from both patient and analyst, because resistance inevitably emerges when disturbing material approaches consciousness. The theoretical foundation for free association rests on Freud's understanding of psychological determinism. He believed that all mental events, including apparently random thoughts and seemingly meaningless associations, are determined by unconscious psychological forces. When patients follow the basic rule and say whatever comes to mind, their verbal productions reveal unconscious connections between ideas, emotions, and memories. The sequence of associations provides clues about underlying psychological conflicts and the defensive operations that keep disturbing material out of awareness. Apparently illogical jumps between topics often reflect unconscious links that would be invisible through normal conversation. The analyst learns to recognize patterns in associative material that point toward repressed conflicts and developmental issues. This detective work requires patience and interpretive skill because unconscious material emerges gradually through multiple associations rather than appearing directly. The meaning often becomes clear only after extended periods of analytic work, when patterns become visible across many sessions. The setting and structure of psychoanalytic sessions facilitate the free association process. Patients typically lie on a couch while the analyst sits out of view behind them. This arrangement reduces visual distractions and social pressures that might inhibit spontaneous expression. The reclined position encourages relaxation and introspection, similar to the state between waking and sleeping when defenses naturally weaken. Sessions occur at regular times, usually 4 to 5 times per week, creating a reliable framework that allows deep psychological work to develop. The consistency of this structure provides security that enables patients to explore frightening or shameful material safely. The analyst maintains an attitude of neutral curiosity, avoiding judgment or advice that might influence the patient's associations artificially. This analytic neutrality creates a blank screen onto which patients can project their unconscious conflicts and relationship patterns without external interference. Learning to free associate effectively requires patients to overcome significant psychological and social conditioning. Most people are trained from childhood to organize their thoughts logically and present themselves in socially acceptable ways. Free association requires abandoning these normal controls and allowing unconscious material to emerge without censorship. Many patients initially struggle with this instruction because it conflicts with their usual ways of communicating and thinking. They might complain that nothing comes to mind or that their thoughts are too trivial or embarrassing to share. These complaints often represent resistance to the analytic process rather than genuine inability to associate freely. The analyst helps patients recognize and work through their resistance while encouraging continued attempts at uncensored expression. Gradually, patients develop the capacity to observe their own mental processes and report them without excessive editing or self-consciousness. Resistance represents the most important phenomenon that emerges during free association. As patients begin to approach repressed material, they unconsciously develop strategies to avoid confronting disturbing psychological content. Resistance might manifest as sudden inability to think of anything to say, complaints about the analytic process, or shifts to intellectualized discussions that avoid emotional material. Patients might arrive late to sessions, forget appointments, or develop physical symptoms that interfere with treatment. These behaviors reflect the ongoing conflict between the desire for psychological healing and the fear of confronting painful truths. Rather than seeing resistance as obstruction, Freud recognized it as valuable information about the patient's defensive operations and underlying conflicts. Working through resistance becomes a central focus of analytic treatment because it reveals the specific ways each individual protects themselves from psychological pain. The analyst interprets resistance patterns to help patients understand their characteristic defensive strategies and their historical origins. Transference emerges naturally during free association as patients begin to experience and express feelings toward their analyst that actually belong to significant figures from their past. The analytic situation recreates aspects of early parent-child relationships where one person holds authority and knowledge while the other seeks help and understanding. Patients might develop intense love, hatred, fear, or dependency feelings toward their analyst that seem inappropriate to the actual therapeutic relationship. These transference reactions provide invaluable information about the patient's early relationship patterns and current interpersonal difficulties. Rather than discouraging transference feelings, the analyst allows them to develop fully while helping the patient understand their origins and meaning. Working through transference relationships often becomes the most important aspect of analytic treatment because it allows patients to experience and resolve conflicts from their developmental history. The intensity of transference reactions can be frightening for both patient and analyst, but these feelings provide direct access to unconscious material that might otherwise remain hidden. Successful analysis of transference leads to increased self-understanding and improved capacity for mature relationships. The analyst's interpretations help patients understand the meaning of their associative material and recognize unconscious patterns in their thoughts and behaviors. Effective interpretations connect current associations with underlying psychological conflicts, developmental history, and relationship patterns. The timing of interpretations is crucial because premature insights can increase resistance, while delayed interpretations might miss important therapeutic opportunities. Analysts must gauge the patient's readiness to accept challenging interpretations without becoming overwhelmed by anxiety or defensive reactions. The goal is not simply to provide intellectual understanding, but to create emotional insight that leads to genuine psychological change. Patients need to experience the truth of interpretations emotionally rather than just accepting them intellectually. This process often involves considerable emotional turmoil as patients confront aspects of themselves they have spent years avoiding. The therapeutic relationship provides the security and support necessary for patients to tolerate this difficult but essential work. Free association also reveals the operation of primary process thinking that normally remains unconscious. As patients relax their logical controls, their associations begin to follow the rules of unconscious mental activity rather than rational thought. Ideas become connected through emotional associations, symbolic similarities, or temporal contiguity rather than logical relationships. The same word might trigger multiple meanings and memories that seem unrelated to conscious reasoning. Patients might jump between topics in ways that seem random, but actually reflect deep psychological connections. Understanding these primary process connections helps both patient and analyst recognize the emotional logic that underlies seemingly irrational behaviors and symptoms. The capacity to think in primary process while maintaining secondary process controls represents psychological flexibility that enhances creativity and emotional intelligence. Learning to appreciate both modes of thinking becomes an important outcome of successful analytic treatment. The technique of free association has influenced many other forms of psychological treatment, even among therapists who do not practice classical psychoanalysis. The basic principle of encouraging uncensored expression to access unconscious material appears in various modified forms across different therapeutic approaches. Creative therapies use art, music, or movement to facilitate free expression when verbal association proves difficult. Group therapy often employs free association principles to explore interpersonal dynamics and shared psychological themes. Even brief therapy approaches sometimes use modified free association techniques to help patients explore their immediate concerns more deeply. The fundamental insight that psychological healing requires access to unconscious material continues to influence contemporary therapy, regardless of theoretical orientation. However, classical free association requires extensive training and considerable time commitment that makes it unsuitable for many therapeutic situations. Understanding the principles behind free association helps all therapists appreciate the importance of creating safe environments where patients can explore their inner psychological worlds without fear of judgment or premature interpretation. Part 9. Transference and Countertransference. Transference represents one of Freud's most profound discoveries about the nature of human relationships and became the centerpiece of psychoanalytic treatment. This phenomenon occurs when patients unconsciously transfer feelings, attitudes, and relationship patterns from significant past relationships onto their analyst in the present therapeutic situation. Rather than relating to the analyst as a real person in the current moment, patients experience and react to them as if they were important figures from their childhood or other formative relationships. Freud initially viewed transference as an obstacle to treatment because it seemed to distract from exploring the patient's actual psychological problems. However, he gradually recognized that transference reactions provide the most direct access to unconscious relationship patterns and unresolved developmental conflicts. The therapeutic relationship becomes a living laboratory, where patients can experience, examine, and potentially resolve psychological issues that originated in their earliest interpersonal experiences. The development of transference follows predictable patterns that reflect each patient's unique relationship history and psychological structure. Initially, most patients experience their analyst as a helpful authority figure who possesses special knowledge and healing power. This positive transference encourages patients to engage in treatment and provides motivation for the difficult work of psychological exploration. However, as therapy progresses and patients begin to approach more threatening psychological material, their transference reactions often become more complex and intense. They might begin to experience their analyst as critical, rejecting, seductive, or controlling, depending on their early relationship experiences with parents and other significant figures. These transference reactions feel completely real and appropriate to patients, even when they bear little resemblance to the analyst's actual behavior or personality. The power of transference demonstrates how powerfully the past continues to shape present experience and how unconscious relationship templates influence all subsequent interpersonal encounters. Understanding transference became essential for explaining why people often have similar relationship problems across different situations and partners. Positive transference manifests when patients idealize their analyst and experience them as perfectly understanding, wise, and caring. They might feel that their analyst is the only person who truly understands them, or that the therapeutic relationship provides love and acceptance they never received elsewhere. While positive transference facilitates therapeutic engagement, it can also create problems when patients become excessively dependent or develop unrealistic expectations about what therapy can provide. Some patients resist terminating treatment because they cannot imagine surviving without their analyst's support and guidance. Others become disappointed and angry when they realize that their analyst is a real person with limitations rather than the perfect parent they never had. Working through positive transference often involves helping patients recognize their idealization patterns and develop more realistic expectations about relationships. The goal is not to destroy the therapeutic relationship, but to help patients understand how their need for perfect love and acceptance might interfere with their capacity to form satisfying, real-world relationships. Learning to tolerate human imperfection in the therapeutic relationship prepares patients for healthier expectations in their other interpersonal connections. Negative transference emerges when patients experience their analyst as critical, rejecting, withholding, or punitive. They might feel that their analyst dislikes them, judges them harshly, or deliberately withholds help and understanding. These feelings often reflect early experiences with parents who were actually critical or rejecting, but they feel equally real when directed towards an analyst who has been consistently supportive. Negative transference can be extremely difficult for both patients and analysts to tolerate because the emotions involved are often intense and painful. Patients might become angry, accusatory or withdrawn while feeling simultaneously dependent on their analyst for help. Some patients attempt to provoke rejection from their analyst to confirm their expectation that relationships inevitably lead to disappointment and abandonment. Working through negative transference requires considerable skill and emotional stability from the analyst, who must remain therapeutically neutral while being attacked or rejected. However, negative transference often provides the most valuable therapeutic material because it reveals the patient's deepest fears and most primitive defensive strategies. Erotic transference occurs when patients develop romantic or sexual feelings toward their analyst. These feelings can range from mild attraction to intense infatuation that dominates the patient's psychological life. Erotic transference often represents the patient's unconscious attempt to recreate and resolve Oedipal conflicts from childhood. The patient might experience their analyst as the idealized parent they wanted to possess exclusively during their phallic stage development. While these feelings can be extremely intense and compelling, they represent unconscious wishes rather than realistic romantic possibilities. The analyst must maintain professional boundaries while helping the patient understand the psychological meaning of their erotic feelings. Working through erotic transference often reveals important information about the patient's sexual development, relationship patterns, and capacity for intimate connection. Patients might learn how they use romantic and sexual feelings to avoid other types of emotional intimacy, or how they repeat problematic relationship patterns across different situations. The analysis of transference requires careful attention to both the patient's conscious experience and the unconscious psychological dynamics that create these intense reactions. The analyst looks for patterns in how the patient relates to them across different sessions and situations. They notice when transference reactions seem disproportionate to current therapeutic interactions and help patients explore the historical origins of these feelings. Genetic interpretations connect current transference reactions with specific childhood experiences and relationship patterns. The analyst might point out how the patient's fear of criticism in therapy relates to their relationship with a harsh parent, or how their need for constant reassurance reflects early experiences of emotional neglect. These interpretations help patients recognize how their past continues to influence their present relationships in unconscious ways. However, intellectual understanding alone is rarely sufficient to create lasting change. Patients need to experience their transference reactions emotionally and work through them within the therapeutic relationship to achieve genuine psychological growth. Countertransference refers to the analyst's emotional reactions to their patient, and initially was considered a problem to be eliminated through personal analysis and professional training. Freud believed that analysts should maintain complete emotional neutrality and avoid allowing their own psychological issues to interfere with treatment. However, later psychoanalytic theorists recognized that countertransference reactions can provide valuable information about the patient's psychological dynamics and interpersonal style. The emotions that patients evoke in their analyst often reflect how they affect other people in their daily relationships. An analyst who feels bored during sessions might be experiencing the emotional withdrawal that the patient uses to avoid intimacy. Feelings of irritation or frustration in the analyst might reflect the patient's unconscious attempts to provoke rejection or punishment. Understanding countertransference requires analysts to maintain awareness of their own emotional reactions while distinguishing between their personal psychological issues and responses that provide diagnostic information about their patients. This sophisticated use of countertransference requires extensive personal analysis and ongoing supervision to ensure that the analyst's reactions serve therapeutic rather than personal needs. The therapeutic management of transference and countertransference represents one of the most challenging aspects of psychoanalytic practice. Analysts must remain emotionally available to experience their patients' projections while maintaining sufficient psychological boundary to avoid becoming overwhelmed or reactive. They need to tolerate being idealized, attacked, seduced, or ignored without retaliating or withdrawing from the therapeutic relationship. This requires considerable personal maturity and professional training because transference reactions can trigger the analyst's own unresolved psychological conflicts. The analyst must also judge when and how to interpret transference reactions to maximize therapeutic benefit without creating excessive anxiety or resistance. Premature transference interpretations can drive patients away from treatment, while delayed interpretations might allow destructive patterns to become entrenched. The timing and wording of transference interpretations require clinical skill that develops through extensive training and supervised experience. Successful transference analysis often represents the most important therapeutic work because it allows patients to understand and modify their fundamental relationship patterns. The resolution of transference reactions leads to some of the most significant therapeutic changes in psychoanalytic treatment. As patients work through their transference relationships, they develop greater self-awareness and more realistic perceptions of other people. They learn to distinguish between past and present relationships and recognize how their unconscious expectations influence their interpersonal experiences. This process often involves considerable grief as patients give up idealized fantasies about perfect relationships and accept the limitations of real human connections. However, this mourning process ultimately leads to greater emotional freedom and the capacity for more satisfying, intimate relationships. Patients who successfully work through their transference reactions often report improved relationships with family members, friends, and romantic partners. They become less likely to repeat destructive relationship patterns and more capable of forming connections based on realistic perceptions rather than unconscious projections. The analysis of transference thus provides a unique opportunity for psychological healing that addresses the interpersonal roots of emotional problems rather than just their surface manifestations. Part 10. The Pleasure Principle versus Reality Principle. The distinction between the pleasure principle and reality principle represents one of Freud's most fundamental insights about how the human mind operates and develops throughout life. These two competing psychological forces create ongoing tension that shapes personality formation, moral development, and the capacity to function effectively in civilized society. The pleasure principle governs primitive mental functioning and seeks immediate gratification of desires without considering practical consequences or moral implications. The reality principle emerges through psychological development and enables delayed gratification, logical thinking, and adaptive behavior in response to environmental demands. Understanding the dynamic relationship between these principles became essential for explaining both normal psychological development and the emergence of mental illness when this balance becomes disrupted. The ongoing negotiation between pleasure-seeking and reality testing occurs largely outside conscious awareness, but influences every aspect of human behavior and decision-making. The pleasure principle operates as the primary psychological force from birth and continues to influence behavior throughout life. It seeks immediate reduction of tension and satisfaction of basic drives without regard for external constraints or future consequences. Infants operate almost entirely according to the pleasure principle, demanding immediate satisfaction when they feel hungry, cold, or uncomfortable. They have no capacity to delay gratification or consider the practical difficulties their demands might create for caregivers. The pleasure principle follows what Freud called primary process thinking, which operates through wish fulfillment, symbolic representation, and emotional associations rather than logical reasoning. This primitive mental functioning knows no contradictions, recognizes no temporal distinctions, and ignores practical limitations. When operating under the pleasure principle, the mind treats wishes as if they were already fulfilled and uses fantasy to provide imaginary satisfaction when real gratification is unavailable. Dreams represent the purest expression of pleasure principle functioning because they allow unlimited wish fulfillment without reality constraints. The reality principle develops gradually as children learn that immediate gratification is not always possible or appropriate. Through repeated experiences of frustration and delay, the developing ego learns to consider practical consequences before acting on impulses. This psychological evolution occurs through interactions with caregivers who cannot always provide immediate satisfaction and environmental limitations that prevent unlimited gratification. Children slowly develop the capacity to tolerate frustration and delay immediate pleasure for greater future satisfaction. The reality principle employs secondary process thinking that follows logical rules, considers temporal sequences, and takes external constraints into account when making decisions. This more sophisticated mental functioning enables planning, problem-solving, and adaptive behavior that increases the likelihood of successful goal achievement. However, the reality principle does not eliminate the pleasure principle, but rather modifies how pleasure-seeking occurs to make it more effective and socially acceptable. The goal remains satisfaction of desires, but the methods become more sophisticated and realistic. The development of reality principle functioning requires sufficient ego strength to tolerate the anxiety and frustration that accompany delayed gratification. Young children often struggle with this process because their emotional regulation systems are still developing and their cognitive abilities remain limited. Tantrums and emotional outbursts often represent failures of reality principle functioning when pleasure principle demands become overwhelming. Gradual mastery of delay and frustration tolerance depends on supportive caregiving that provides security while maintaining appropriate limits and expectations. Children who receive consistent emotional support develop confidence that their needs will eventually be met, making it easier to tolerate temporary frustration. Those who experience unreliable caregiving might struggle to develop reality principle functioning because they cannot trust that delayed gratification will ever lead to satisfaction. Trauma and severe stress can also interfere with this developmental process by overwhelming the child's capacity to manage emotional regulation and rational thinking. Understanding these developmental factors became important for explaining why some individuals continue to struggle with impulse control and delayed gratification throughout their lives. The dynamic tension between pleasure and reality principles manifests differently across various psychological disorders and personality types. Psychotic conditions often involve regression to predominantly pleasure principle functioning, where reality testing becomes severely impaired. Patients might act as if their fantasies were real or make decisions based on wish fulfillment rather than practical considerations. Manic episodes frequently represent temporary dominance of pleasure principle thinking, where individuals pursue immediate gratification without considering negative consequences. Conversely, some neurotic conditions involve excessive reality principle functioning that creates rigid, joyless personalities unable to experience spontaneous pleasure. Obsessive-compulsive individuals might become so focused on controlling every aspect of their environment that they lose touch with their genuine desires and emotional needs. Healthy psychological functioning requires flexible movement between these two principles depending on situational demands and personal needs. The capacity to be spontaneous and pleasure-seeking in appropriate contexts while maintaining realistic judgment when necessary represents optimal psychological development. Sublimation represents the most sophisticated resolution of tension between pleasure and reality principles. This process channels primitive impulses into socially valuable activities that provide partial satisfaction while contributing to individual and cultural development. An aggressive person might become a successful surgeon who satisfies their destructive impulses through socially beneficial cutting activities. Someone with strong sexual drives might channel this energy into artistic creativity that expresses passion while adhering to social moral standards. Sublimation allows pleasure principle satisfaction through reality principle methods, creating win-win solutions that benefit both the individual and society. Freud believed that civilization's greatest achievements in art, science, and culture emerge from successful sublimation of primitive psychological forces. However, sublimation requires sufficient psychological sophistication to transform raw impulses into complex creative activities. Not everyone possesses the ego strength or creative capacity necessary for effective sublimation, leading to ongoing conflicts between pleasure-seeking and social conformity. The pleasure principle continues to influence adult behavior in numerous ways that often operate outside conscious awareness. Consumer culture exploits pleasure principle psychology by encouraging immediate gratification through purchasing decisions that provide temporary satisfaction but may create long-term financial problems. Addiction represents an extreme example of pleasure principle dominance where individuals pursue immediate chemical satisfaction despite devastating consequences to their health, relationships, and life goals. Even in healthy individuals, pleasure principle impulses constantly compete with reality-based decision-making in areas like diet, exercise, work habits, and relationship choices. The modern environment often provides more opportunities for immediate gratification than human psychology evolved to handle effectively. Technology enables instant communication, entertainment, and information access that can interfere with the development of frustration tolerance and delayed gratification skills. Understanding these dynamics helps explain contemporary psychological problems and social phenomena that seem puzzling without appreciating the ongoing influence of primitive psychological forces. Educational and therapeutic interventions often focus on strengthening reality principle functioning to help individuals make decisions that serve their long-term well-being rather than just immediate impulses. The therapeutic implications of understanding pleasure and reality principle dynamics are extensive and influence many different treatment approaches. Psychoanalytic therapy often focuses on helping patients recognize how unconscious pleasure principle impulses influence their conscious decision-making and create self-destructive behavioral patterns. Cognitive behavioral approaches teach reality testing skills and delayed gratification strategies that strengthen reality principle functioning. Dialectical behavior therapy specifically addresses difficulties with emotional regulation and impulse control that represent failures of reality principle development. However, effective treatment also requires attention to legitimate pleasure principle needs that may have been suppressed or ignored through excessive focus on practical demands. Some patients develop psychological problems because they have become disconnected from their genuine desires and emotional needs in attempts to conform to external expectations. Therapeutic work might involve helping these individuals reconnect with their authentic feelings and develop healthier ways to pursue satisfaction and joy. The goal is not to eliminate pleasure-seeking, but to achieve better integration between immediate gratification and long-term goal achievement. Cultural and social factors significantly influence how individuals negotiate the tension between pleasure and reality principles. Different societies place varying emphasis on individual gratification versus collective responsibility, creating different psychological challenges for their members. Cultures that emphasize immediate pleasure and individual freedom might struggle with problems related to impulse control and delayed gratification. Those that prioritize duty and self-sacrifice might create individuals who are overly controlled and disconnected from their emotional needs. Economic systems also influence this dynamic by determining how much security individuals have about meeting their basic needs. People who experience chronic scarcity might have difficulty developing reality principle functioning because their survival depends on taking immediate opportunities for gratification. Understanding these broader contextual factors became important for applying psychoanalytic insights to social problems and cultural phenomena. The balance between pleasure and reality principles represents not just an individual psychological challenge, but a fundamental tension that shapes the development of human societies and civilizations. Part 11. Life Drive versus Death Drive. Later in his career, Freud developed a comprehensive theory about two fundamental psychological forces that govern all mental activity and drive human behavior throughout life. Eros, the life drive, encompasses all impulses toward survival, growth, reproduction, and the creation of increasingly complex unities. Thanatos, the death drive, represents opposing forces that seek destruction, dissolution, and return to the inorganic state that existed before life began. This dualistic model emerged from Freud's observations of patients who compulsively repeated traumatic experiences and his attempts to understand the psychological origins of human aggression and self-destructive behavior. The dynamic tension between these two drives creates the fundamental psychological conflicts that shape personality development, interpersonal relationships, and the broader patterns of human civilization. Understanding this theoretical framework became essential for explaining phenomena that seem to contradict the pleasure principle, particularly the human tendency toward repetition of painful experiences and attraction to dangerous or destructive activities. Eros represents far more than sexual impulses, though sexuality remains one of its most important manifestations. The life drive includes all psychological forces that promote survival, growth, development, and the formation of increasingly complex psychological and social structures. At the biological level, Eros manifests through drives for food, water, shelter, and other necessities that maintain physical existence. Psychologically, it appears as curiosity, creativity, learning, and the desire to form meaningful relationships with other people. Socially, Eros drives the formation of families, communities and civilizations that enable humans to cooperate and achieve goals impossible for isolated individuals. The life drive seeks to bind separate elements together into larger, more complex unities through love, attachment, and creative synthesis. Artists who combine colors and shapes into beautiful paintings, scientists who discover unifying principles that explain diverse phenomena, and lovers who merge their separate identities into intimate partnerships all express eros in different forms. The life drive provides the psychological energy for all constructive, creative and growth-oriented activities that characterize healthy human development. The sexual aspects of eros extend beyond reproductive behavior to include all forms of pleasure-seeking, sensual enjoyment and intimate connection. Freud believed that sexual energy, or libido, provides the fundamental fuel for psychological development and social cooperation. However, he used sexuality in a broader sense than genital activity to include all pleasurable physical and emotional experiences that promote life and growth. The capacity for sensual pleasure motivates people to seek experiences that enhance their vitality and well-being. Intimate relationships provide not only sexual satisfaction, but also emotional security, companionship, and the foundation for creating and nurturing new life. Even sublimated forms of sexual energy contribute to artistic creation, intellectual achievement, and spiritual development. The life drive thus encompasses everything from basic survival instincts to the highest forms of human cultural achievement. All these diverse manifestations share the common goal of promoting, enhancing, and celebrating life in its various forms. Thanatos, the death drive, initially seemed to contradict everything Freud had previously believed about human motivation and the pleasure principle. His observations of World War I veterans who compulsively relived their traumatic experiences through nightmares and repetitive behaviors forced him to recognize psychological forces that seemed to operate beyond the pleasure principle. These patients appeared driven to repeat painful experiences rather than seeking pleasure or avoiding pain as his earlier theories had predicted. Freud gradually realized that these repetition compulsions served the death drive's goal of reducing psychological tension to zero through return to an inorganic state. The death drive manifests through aggressive impulses toward others and self-destructive behaviors that ultimately serve the goal of eliminating the tensions and conflicts inherent in conscious existence. At its most extreme, Thanatos seeks the complete cessation of mental activity and return to the peaceful unconsciousness that preceded birth. However, the death drive also operates in less dramatic ways through everyday behaviors that reduce stimulation, avoid challenge, and seek psychological equilibrium through minimizing rather than maximizing experience. Understanding the death drive helped explain why people sometimes sabotage their own success, choose destructive relationships, or engage in risky behaviors that seem to serve no rational purpose. Aggression represents the most obvious manifestation of the death drive when it is directed outward toward other people or objects in the environment. Rather than viewing aggression as simply a response to frustration, Freud came to see it as an independent drive that seeks destruction for its own sake. This aggressive energy must find expression either through attacks on external targets or through self-directed destructive behaviors. War, violence, cruelty, and sadistic behavior all represent death drive energy directed toward destroying others. However, the same destructive impulses can be turned inward, creating depression, self-hatred, guilt, and suicidal behavior. People who struggle with chronic self-criticism, eating disorders, substance abuse or other self-destructive patterns might be expressing death drive energy through attacks on themselves. The death drive also appears in more subtle forms through pessimism, cynicism, and the tendency to focus on negative aspects of experience while ignoring positive possibilities. Understanding aggression as an independent drive rather than just a response to external circumstances had important implications for both individual therapy and social policy. The repetition compulsion represents perhaps the most puzzling manifestation of the death drive because it seems to violate the basic assumption that people seek pleasure and avoid pain. Freud observed that patients often unconsciously recreate traumatic experiences in new situations, apparently seeking to repeat rather than resolve their psychological wounds. A woman who was abandoned by her father might repeatedly choose romantic partners who eventually reject her, recreating the original trauma despite its painful consequences. Veterans might unconsciously seek dangerous situations that remind them of combat experiences they consciously want to forget. Children who were abused might engage in self-injurious behaviors or gravitate toward abusive relationships that feel familiar despite being destructive. The repetition compulsion serves the death drive's goal of mastering traumatic experiences by reducing them to predictable, controllable patterns. By repeatedly recreating traumatic situations, the unconscious mind attempts to gain power over experiences that originally felt overwhelming and helpless. However, this strategy often backfires by creating new trauma and preventing the psychological growth that would come from successfully moving beyond past wounds. The death drive also manifests through what Freud called the conservative tendency of psychological life. While Eros seeks growth, change, and increasing complexity, Thanatos pulls toward stasis, regression, and return to earlier states of being. This conservative force appears in resistance to psychological change, preference for familiar routines over new experiences, and nostalgia for supposedly simpler times in the past. People who remain stuck in destructive patterns despite their conscious desire for change might be expressing death drive resistance to the growth and development that would disrupt their psychological equilibrium. The death drive seeks to reduce all tension and conflict by eliminating the dynamic processes that create psychological complexity. In extreme cases, this might involve regression to infantile states where responsibility and conscious decision-making are unnecessary. The appeal of drugs, alcohol, and other consciousness-altering substances often reflects death drive wishes to escape the tensions and conflicts of normal waking life. Even sleep and meditation can serve death drive functions when they are used to avoid rather than refresh and restore psychological vitality. The interaction between life and death drives creates the fundamental dynamic tension that characterizes all psychological life. Rather than viewing these as opposing forces that must be resolved through victory of one over the other, Freud recognized that both drives are necessary and inevitable aspects of human psychology. Healthy psychological development requires achieving dynamic balance between constructive and destructive impulses rather than eliminating either completely. Too much life drive energy without sufficient death drive regulation can create manic behavior, impulsivity, and unrealistic optimism that ignores practical limitations and dangers. Conversely, excessive death drive dominance leads to depression, withdrawal, and inability to engage productively with life's challenges and opportunities. The goal of psychological maturity involves learning to harness both types of energy constructively. Death-drive energy can fuel necessary endings, realistic assessment of limitations, and the capacity to let go of relationships or situations that no longer serve growth and development. Life-drive energy provides motivation for creative achievement, intimate connection, and the courage to take risks necessary for psychological and social progress. Sublimation becomes even more important when understood in terms of life and death drive dynamics. This process involves channeling both constructive and destructive impulses into socially valuable activities that serve civilization while providing partial satisfaction of primitive drives. Competitive sports allow expression of aggressive death drive energy through controlled combat that builds character and entertains spectators without causing serious harm. Scientific research channels both life drive curiosity and death drive analytical destruction into investigations that advance human knowledge and capability. Artistic creation combines life drive synthesis with death drive elimination of conventional forms to produce new cultural expressions that enrich human experience. Even surgical medicine requires integration of life drive healing impulses with death drive cutting and destruction of diseased tissue. Successful sublimation requires sufficient psychological sophistication to transform raw drive energy into complex cultural activities that serve both individual satisfaction and social progress. Freud believed that civilization's future depends on humanity's capacity to develop increasingly effective sublimation techniques that channel destructive impulses into constructive activities. The concepts of life and death drives had profound implications for understanding both individual psychological problems and broader social phenomena. Mental illness often involves disruption of the normal balance between these two fundamental forces. Depression might represent death drive dominance that overwhelms life-affirming impulses and creates withdrawal from engaging productively with existence. Manic episodes could reflect temporary life drive dominance that creates unrealistic optimism and impulsive behavior without adequate reality testing. Understanding these dynamics helped psychoanalytic therapists develop treatment strategies that aim to restore healthy balance, rather than simply eliminating symptoms. At the social level, these concepts provided frameworks for understanding war, revolution, and other collective manifestations of destructive impulses. Freud became increasingly concerned that technological advances were providing humanity with unprecedented capacity for destruction, without corresponding development of psychological wisdom necessary to control these dangerous capabilities. The dual drive theory thus became central to his later pessimistic assessments of civilization's prospects and his warnings about the need for greater psychological understanding to prevent self-destruction on a global scale. Part 12. Narcissism, Anxiety and Neurosis. Freud's understanding of narcissism evolved significantly throughout his career, as he recognized its fundamental role in both normal psychological development and various forms of mental illness. Initially, he viewed narcissism simply as a perverse form of sexuality, where individuals direct their libidinal energy toward themselves rather than toward external love objects. However, his clinical observations revealed that narcissistic processes play essential roles in healthy psychological development, and that problems with narcissistic regulation contribute to many different types of psychological disorders. Primary narcissism represents the normal self-love that characterizes early childhood, when the ego has not yet clearly differentiated itself from the external world. Secondary narcissism emerges when libidinal energy is withdrawn from external objects and redirected toward the self, often as a defensive response to disappointment or trauma in relationships. Understanding narcissistic dynamics became crucial for explaining how people develop self-esteem, maintain psychological cohesion under stress, and form healthy relationships with others throughout their lives. Primary narcissism characterizes the normal psychological state of early infancy when the child experiences themselves as the center of the universe. Babies initially cannot distinguish between their own needs and desires and the external world that either satisfies or frustrates these impulses. They experience their caregivers as extensions of themselves, rather than as separate individuals with their own needs and limitations. This narcissistic phase serves important developmental functions by providing the psychological foundation for self-esteem and personal agency. Children need to feel powerful and important before they can tolerate the realistic limitations that come with recognizing their dependence on others. Healthy narcissistic development requires caregivers who can mirror the child's sense of specialness while gradually introducing realistic expectations and boundaries. Parents who provide consistent admiration and validation help children develop stable self-esteem that can withstand later disappointments and criticisms. Conversely, children who receive inadequate mirroring or excessive criticism during this crucial period might struggle with self-esteem problems throughout their lives. The transition from primary narcissism to object love represents one of the most important developmental achievements of early childhood. Children gradually learn to recognize that their parents are separate individuals with their own needs, feelings and limitations. This realization initially creates anxiety and disappointment because it means that perfect gratification is impossible and that love must be earned rather than simply expected. However, successful navigation of this transition enables children to form genuine relationships based on mutual recognition and reciprocal care, rather than narcissistic exploitation. The capacity to love others while maintaining healthy self-regard requires integration of narcissistic and object-oriented impulses. People need sufficient self-love to maintain their psychological integrity while also being able to care genuinely about other people's welfare. Problems during this developmental transition can create either excessive narcissism that interferes with forming intimate relationships, or insufficient narcissism that leads to self-destructive patterns of excessive self-sacrifice. Understanding these dynamics became essential for helping patients achieve healthier relationship patterns and more stable self-esteem. Pathological narcissism emerges when normal narcissistic development becomes disrupted by trauma, inadequate parenting, or constitutional factors that interfere with healthy ego formation. Narcissistic individuals often present a paradoxical combination of grandiose self-importance and underlying feelings of inadequacy and shame. They might demand constant admiration and special treatment while being extremely sensitive to any criticism or perceived slight. Their relationships tend to be exploitative because they view other people primarily as sources of narcissistic gratification rather than as separate individuals worthy of genuine care and respect. Narcissistic rage can erupt when their sense of specialness is threatened, or when they encounter limits and boundaries that conflict with their grandiose expectations. These individuals often struggle with empathy because recognizing other people's separate needs and feelings would threaten their narcissistic sense of being the center of the universe. However, their grandiosity often masks deep feelings of emptiness, worthlessness, and terror of being ordinary or unimportant. Understanding the defensive function of narcissistic behaviors helped therapists develop more effective treatment approaches that addressed underlying vulnerabilities rather than simply confronting grandiose presentations. Anxiety occupies a central position in Freudian theory because it serves as the signal that alerts the ego to psychological danger and motivates defensive operations. Freud distinguished between realistic anxiety that responds to actual external threats and neurotic anxiety that emerges from internal psychological conflicts. Realistic anxiety serves adaptive functions by motivating appropriate responses to dangerous situations and helping people avoid genuine threats to their safety and well-being. Neurotic anxiety arises when unconscious impulses threaten to break through repressive barriers and enter conscious awareness. The ego experiences these emerging impulses as dangerous because acting on them would create conflict with superego demands or external reality constraints. For example, someone might experience anxiety in social situations because unconscious aggressive impulses threaten to emerge in ways that would damage important relationships. Understanding the different sources of anxiety became crucial for developing effective therapeutic interventions that address underlying conflicts rather than simply treating surface symptoms. Anxiety disorders often represent unsuccessful attempts by the ego to manage overwhelming internal conflicts through various defensive strategies. Signal anxiety represents the ego's early warning system that detects potential psychological dangers before they become overwhelming. This sophisticated psychological mechanism allows the ego to implement defensive strategies that prevent unconscious conflicts from disrupting conscious functioning. When signal anxiety operates effectively, people can navigate psychological challenges without developing disabling symptoms. However, when the ego becomes overwhelmed by competing demands from the ID, superego, and external reality, signal anxiety can escalate into panic attacks or chronic anxiety disorders. Castration anxiety represents a specific type of signal anxiety that emerges during the phallic stage when children fear punishment for their Oedipal desires. This anxiety motivates identification with the same-sex parent and contributes to superego formation. Separation anxiety reflects fears of losing important attachment relationships and can emerge at various developmental stages when people face actual or threatened losses. Understanding these different types of anxiety helped psychoanalysts recognize the developmental origins of adult anxiety symptoms and design treatments that address their underlying psychological functions. Neurosis represents a compromise formation where the ego attempts to satisfy conflicting demands from the ID, superego, and external reality through symptom formation. Unlike psychosis, where reality testing becomes severely impaired, neurotic individuals maintain basic contact with external reality while developing symptoms that serve unconscious psychological functions. Conversion hysteria transforms psychological conflicts into physical symptoms that symbolically express repressed impulses while maintaining repression. A woman who cannot express anger toward her husband might develop paralysis in her arm that prevents her from striking him while symbolically expressing her aggressive feelings. Obsessive-compulsive neurosis involves repetitive thoughts and behaviors that serve to bind anxiety and prevent the emergence of forbidden impulses. Someone with contamination fears might compulsively wash their hands to symbolically cleanse themselves of guilty, sexual, or aggressive thoughts. Phobic neurosis displaces anxiety from internal conflicts onto external objects or situations that can be avoided more easily than confronting the underlying psychological issues. These neurotic solutions provide temporary relief from psychological conflict, but often create new problems that interfere with normal functioning and relationships. The neurotic character represents a more pervasive form of neurotic organization, where personality traits rather than discrete symptoms serve defensive functions. Obsessive-compulsive personality involves excessive orderliness, perfectionism, and control that defend against underlying chaotic or aggressive impulses. Hysterical personality features dramatic emotional expression and attention-seeking behaviors that defend against underlying feelings of emptiness or inadequacy. Masochistic personality involves patterns of self-sacrifice and victimization that serve unconscious guilt and need for punishment. These character patterns often feel natural and egosyntonic to the individuals who develop them, making them more difficult to recognize and treat than acute neurotic symptoms. However, they create ongoing problems in relationships and limit the person's capacity for spontaneous emotional expression and genuine intimacy. Understanding character neuroses became important for psychoanalytic treatment, because these patterns often need to be analyzed and worked through before underlying conflicts can be resolved. The goal is not to eliminate defensive character traits entirely, but to make them more flexible and less rigidly controlling of the person's emotional life. Psychosis represents a more severe form of mental illness, where the ego's capacity to test reality becomes fundamentally compromised. Unlike neurotic individuals who maintain awareness that their symptoms are problems, psychotic patients often experience their delusions and hallucinations as completely real and valid. Freud believed that psychosis results from massive withdrawal of libidinal energy from external objects back into the self, creating a state of pathological narcissism. The psychotic individual loses the capacity to form meaningful relationships with other people and retreats into a private world of fantasy and delusion. However, Freud also recognized that psychotic symptoms often represent attempts at psychological healing, rather than simply manifestations of illness. Delusions might provide alternative explanations for confusing and overwhelming experiences, while hallucinations could offer substitute relationships when real human connections have become too frightening or disappointing. Understanding the defensive and restitutive functions of psychotic symptoms influenced the development of more empathetic and effective treatment approaches. Rather than simply trying to eliminate symptoms, therapists began to appreciate how these symptoms served important psychological functions and worked to help patients develop healthier ways of meeting these underlying needs. The relationship between narcissism, anxiety, and neurosis reveals the complex interconnections between different aspects of psychological functioning. Narcissistic injuries often trigger anxiety responses that motivate neurotic defensive strategies aimed at protecting fragile self-esteem. Someone who experiences criticism as a devastating attack on their self-worth might develop obsessive behaviors designed to prevent future mistakes and criticisms. Conversely, neurotic symptoms can serve narcissistic functions by providing special identity and attention that compensate for underlying feelings of inadequacy. A person with conversion symptoms might receive care and concern that was unavailable when they were healthy, creating secondary gains that maintain the neurotic condition. Anxiety about loss of narcissistic supplies can motivate various neurotic behaviors designed to secure continued admiration and special treatment. Understanding these dynamic relationships became essential for effective psychoanalytic treatment because addressing symptoms in isolation often fails to resolve underlying psychological conflicts. Successful therapy typically requires working through narcissistic vulnerabilities, anxiety management skills, and neurotic character patterns in an integrated approach that recognizes their mutual influence and supports overall psychological development toward greater maturity and relationship capacity. Part 13. Parapraxes, Sublimation and Civilization. Freud's investigation of parapraxes, commonly known as Freudian slips, revealed how unconscious psychological processes continuously influence everyday behavior in ways that most people never recognize or understand. These seemingly accidental mistakes in speech, memory, and action actually represent meaningful expressions of repressed thoughts and conflicts that break through conscious censorship. The psychopathology of everyday life demonstrates that unconscious forces operate not only in dreams and neurotic symptoms, but in the most ordinary aspects of human experience. Slips of the tongue, forgotten names, misplaced objects, and accidental injuries often serve unconscious purposes that would be unacceptable if acknowledged directly. Understanding parapraxes became important for psychoanalytic theory because they provide evidence that psychological determinism operates throughout conscious life rather than being limited to special circumstances like sleep or mental illness. These everyday phenomena also offer accessible examples of unconscious functioning that help people recognize the hidden psychological forces that influence their daily experiences. Slips of the tongue represent the most widely recognized type of parapraxes, where people accidentally say something different from what they consciously intended. These verbal errors often reveal repressed thoughts or feelings that the speaker would prefer to keep hidden from others or even from themselves. A person might accidentally call their current romantic partner by their ex-lover's name, revealing unconscious preoccupation with the previous relationship. Someone feeling hostile toward their boss might accidentally use an insulting word when trying to offer a compliment. Political figures sometimes make revealing slips that expose their true attitudes despite their public positions. These errors occur because unconscious material possesses dynamic energy that constantly seeks expression and occasionally overwhelms conscious censorship mechanisms. The specific content of verbal slips often provides valuable insights into the speaker's psychological conflicts and repressed emotional states. However, not every mistake represents a meaningful unconscious communication, and distinguishing between random errors and psychologically significant slips requires careful analysis of context and patterns. Forgetting represents another important category of parapraxis, where memory failures serve unconscious defensive functions. People often forget names, appointments, or information that would create anxiety or conflict if remembered accurately. Someone might consistently forget their dentist appointments because of unconscious anxiety about dental procedures. A person could repeatedly forget to return phone calls from someone they unconsciously resent or wish to avoid. Students might forget to study for exams in subjects that trigger feelings of inadequacy or competitive anxiety. The selectivity of these memory failures suggests that unconscious motivation, rather than random neural dysfunction, determines what gets forgotten and what remains accessible. Repressed memories represent extreme examples of motivated forgetting where traumatic experiences become completely inaccessible to conscious recollection. However, even minor forgetting incidents can reveal important information about unconscious conflicts and emotional states that influence daily behavior. Losing or misplacing objects often serves unconscious purposes related to ambivalent feelings about the lost items or their symbolic meanings. Someone might repeatedly lose jewelry given by a romantic partner they have conflicted feelings about. A student could misplace textbooks for courses they unconsciously resent having to take. People sometimes lose important documents when they feel ambivalent about the commitments or responsibilities these papers represent. The timing of lost objects often correlates with psychological states and life circumstances in ways that suggest unconscious motivation. Items might disappear before important decisions or stressful events when the unconscious mind seeks to avoid confronting difficult situations. Finding lost objects sometimes occurs when the psychological conditions that motivated their loss have changed. Understanding the unconscious functions of losing things can help people recognize their ambivalent feelings and address underlying conflicts more directly. Accidental injuries and seemingly random mishaps frequently serve unconscious self-punitive functions or express repressed aggressive impulses. Someone who feels guilty about their success might accidentally injure themselves in ways that sabotage important opportunities or achievements. A person harboring unconscious resentment toward family members might have accidents that force others to provide care and attention. Athletes sometimes suffer mysterious injuries before important competitions, when unconscious fears of failure or success create internal conflicts. These accidents feel completely involuntary and unintentional to the people who experience them, making it difficult to recognize their psychological significance. However, patterns of accident proneness often correlate with psychological states and life circumstances in ways that suggest unconscious determination. Understanding the potential psychological functions of accidents can help people recognize self-destructive patterns and address underlying emotional conflicts more constructively. However, it is important to avoid over-interpreting random misfortunes as psychologically meaningful when simpler explanations might be more appropriate. Sublimation represents one of Freud's most optimistic concepts because it explains how primitive psychological impulses can be transformed into culturally valuable achievements that benefit both individuals and society. This process involves redirecting libidinal and aggressive energies away from their original sexual and destructive aims towards socially acceptable activities that provide partial satisfaction while contributing to civilization. Unlike other defense mechanisms that simply avoid or distort psychological conflicts, sublimation allows genuine expression of drive energy through constructive channels. Artistic creation provides classic examples of sublimation, where sexual and aggressive impulses fuel creative works that enhance cultural life. Scientific research channels curiosity and investigative impulses into discoveries that advance human knowledge and capability. Competitive sports allow expression of aggressive drives through controlled contests that build character and entertain audiences without causing serious harm. Sublimation requires sufficient ego strength to redirect powerful impulses without losing contact with their underlying emotional energy. Successful sublimation creates win-win solutions that satisfy primitive drives while serving broader social purposes. The capacity for sublimation varies significantly among individuals depending on their psychological development, creative abilities, and social opportunities. Some people possess natural talents that facilitate the transformation of drive energy into artistic, intellectual, or athletic achievements. Others struggle to find socially acceptable outlets for their primitive impulses and may resort to less healthy defensive strategies. Cultural factors also influence sublimation possibilities by determining which activities are valued and supported by society. Societies that provide extensive opportunities for creative expression, intellectual achievement, and physical competition enable more effective sublimation than those with limited outlets. However, excessive sublimation can create problems when people become disconnected from their underlying emotional needs and impulses. Overly intellectualized individuals might lose touch with their passionate feelings and become rigid or emotionally flat. The goal is not to eliminate primitive impulses entirely, but to find balanced ways of expressing them that serve both personal satisfaction and social contribution. Freud's analysis of civilization revealed how sublimation enables human societies to function while creating inevitable psychological tensions and conflicts. Civilization requires individuals to renounce immediate gratification of their sexual and aggressive impulses in favor of delayed gratification and social cooperation. This renunciation creates what Freud called civilization's discontents, ongoing psychological stress that results from suppressing natural human impulses. However, the same energy that gets redirected away from primitive satisfaction powers the cultural achievements that make civilized life possible and worthwhile. Art, science, technology and moral systems all depend on successful sublimation of individual drive energy into collective cultural projects. The development of language, law and social institutions requires people to channel their natural selfishness and aggression into cooperative activities. However, this process comes at psychological costs that manifest in neurosis, anxiety and various forms of individual and social pathology. Understanding these dynamics became crucial for addressing both personal psychological problems and broader social issues that emerge from civilization's demands. The relationship between individual psychological development and cultural progress represents one of Freud's most important insights about human nature. Each person must recapitulate civilization's development by learning to control their primitive impulses and channel them into socially acceptable activities. Children who successfully navigate this process become productive members of society capable of contributing to cultural advancement. Those who fail to achieve adequate sublimation may become antisocial, mentally ill, or unable to function effectively in civilized society. However, excessive civilization demands can also create psychological problems by requiring too much instinctual renunciation. Some individuals and cultures may benefit from greater acceptance of natural human impulses rather than continued attempts at suppression and sublimation. The optimal balance between instinctual expression and cultural demands varies among individuals and historical periods. Understanding these dynamics helps explain both personal psychological difficulties and broader social movements that seek to modify civilization's requirements. Religious and moral systems play crucial roles in facilitating sublimation by providing ideological frameworks that give meaning to instinctual renunciation. Religious teachings often encourage believers to redirect sexual and aggressive energies toward spiritual activities and service to others. Moral codes provide guidelines for transforming selfish impulses into ethical behavior that serves community welfare. However, Freud recognized that religious and moral systems can also create psychological problems when they demand excessive suppression of natural human needs. Rigid religious teachings might generate neurotic guilt and sexual dysfunction by condemning normal biological impulses as sinful. Overly strict moral codes could create compulsive personality patterns that interfere with spontaneous emotional expression and genuine relationships. The challenge involves finding religious and moral approaches that facilitate healthy sublimation without creating psychological pathology. Understanding the psychological functions of religious and moral systems became important for both individual therapy and social analysis of cultural institutions. Modern technological society presents new challenges and opportunities for sublimation that Freud could not have fully anticipated. Digital technology provides unprecedented outlets for creative expression through social media, online art, and virtual communities. However, it also creates new forms of instant gratification that might interfere with the development of sublimation capacities. Video games and online entertainment can provide immediate satisfaction of aggressive and competitive impulses without requiring the patience and skill development that characterize traditional sublimation. Consumer culture encourages direct gratification of desires through purchasing rather than the creative transformation that sublimation involves. Understanding these modern challenges requires updating Freudian concepts to address contemporary psychological and social realities. The fundamental insights about the need to channel primitive impulses constructively remain relevant, but the specific methods and opportunities for sublimation continue to evolve with cultural changes. Effective approaches to individual psychological health and social policy must consider how contemporary conditions either facilitate or interfere with healthy sublimation processes. Part 14. Case Studies and Clinical Applications. Freud's revolutionary theories emerged primarily from his intensive clinical work with individual patients, whose psychological problems challenged conventional medical understanding and treatment approaches. His detailed case studies provided the empirical foundation for psychoanalytic concepts and demonstrated how unconscious conflicts manifest in various forms of mental illness. These cases also illustrated the therapeutic process through which patients could achieve insight into their unconscious motivations and develop healthier psychological functioning. The most famous cases include Anna O, who inspired the development of the talking cure, little Hans and his phobia of horses, Dora and her hysteria, and the rat man with his obsessive-compulsive symptoms. Each case contributed essential insights about specific psychological mechanisms while revealing the complex interplay between childhood experiences, unconscious conflicts, and adult symptoms. Understanding these clinical examples became crucial for training future psychoanalysts and demonstrating the practical applications of Freudian theory in therapeutic settings. The case of Anna O, whose real name was Bertha Pappenheim, represents the foundational case that led to the development of psychoanalytic treatment methods. Although initially treated by Freud's colleague Joseph Breuer, this case profoundly influenced Freud's understanding of hysteria and the therapeutic power of verbal expression. Anna O developed numerous conversion symptoms, including paralysis, speech difficulties, and visual disturbances following her father's serious illness and death. Her symptoms appeared to have no organic basis and followed patterns that suggested psychological rather than medical causation. Breuer discovered that when Anna O could recall and emotionally express the memories associated with specific symptoms, those symptoms would temporarily disappear. She called this process the talking cure or chimney sweeping, recognizing its cathartic effects on her psychological state. This case demonstrated that hysterical symptoms could be understood as meaningful expressions of repressed psychological conflicts rather than mysterious medical conditions. The therapeutic relationship also revealed the phenomenon of transference when Anna O developed intense romantic feelings toward Breuer that recreated her relationship with her father. Little Hans provided the first major case study of childhood psychological development and demonstrated how adult neurotic patterns originate in early childhood conflicts. This 5-year-old boy developed an intense phobia of horses that prevented him from leaving his house and severely disrupted his normal activities. Through analysis conducted primarily by the boy's father under Freud's supervision, the phobia was traced to unconscious Oedipal conflicts and castration anxiety. Hans had witnessed horses falling down and being whipped, which became associated with his fears about punishment for his sexual feelings toward his mother. The horses symbolically represented his father, whom he both loved and feared as a rival for maternal affection. His phobia served multiple unconscious functions, including expressing his aggressive feelings toward his father while avoiding direct confrontation that might lead to retaliation. The successful resolution of Hans's symptoms through interpretation of his unconscious conflicts provided powerful evidence for the Oedipal theory and the effectiveness of psychoanalytic treatment with children. This case also demonstrated how parents could be taught to understand and respond therapeutically to their children's psychological conflicts. The case of Dora, an 18-year-old woman with conversion hysteria, illustrated the complex relationship between sexual trauma, family dynamics, and neurotic symptom formation. Dora suffered from various physical symptoms, including coughing, loss of voice, and fainting spells that had no apparent medical cause. Her symptoms were connected to sexual advances from Herr K., a family friend, and the complex web of relationships involving her father's affair with Herr K.'s wife. Freud's analysis revealed how Dora's symptoms expressed her conflicted feelings about sexuality, her anger toward the adults who had betrayed her trust, and her unconscious identification with various figures in her family drama. However, this case also demonstrated the limitations and potential problems of early psychoanalytic technique when Dora abruptly terminated treatment after Freud made premature interpretations about her unconscious feelings. The case highlighted the importance of timing in therapeutic interventions and the need to carefully build trust before confronting patients with disturbing insights about their unconscious motivations. Dora's case also raised important questions about the analyst's role in cases involving actual sexual trauma and the balance between exploring psychological conflicts and validating real experiences of abuse or exploitation. Modern readers have criticized Freud's apparent dismissal of the reality of sexual trauma in favor of focusing on Dora's unconscious fantasies and conflicts. The Rat Man case provided detailed insights into obsessive-compulsive neurosis and demonstrated how bizarre symptoms could be understood as meaningful expressions of unconscious conflicts. This young lawyer was tormented by obsessive thoughts about a torture device involving rats that would eat through a person's anus. His compulsive behaviors and intrusive thoughts created severe distress and interfered with his ability to function normally in work and relationships. Freud's analysis revealed that the rat obsession symbolically represented the patient's conflicted feelings about money, sexuality, and his relationship with his deceased father. The German word for rats also meant installments or payments, connecting the obsession to financial conflicts between duty to his father and desires for independence. The anal focus of the torture fantasy related to unconscious conflicts about control, submission, and repressed homosexual impulses. Through careful analysis of the patient's associations and the historical development of his symptoms, Freud was able to trace the obsession to specific childhood experiences and ongoing psychological conflicts. The successful treatment demonstrated how even the most bizarre and disturbing symptoms could be resolved through understanding their unconscious meaning and helping the patient work through underlying emotional conflicts. Freud's theories about human sexuality evolved significantly throughout his career, as he attempted to understand the role of sexual impulses in psychological development and mental illness. Initially, he believed that all neuroses resulted from actual sexual trauma or inadequate sexual satisfaction in adult life. However, his clinical experience gradually led him to recognize that fantasy and unconscious sexual conflicts played equally important roles in symptom formation. The concept of infantile sexuality shocked Victorian society but became central to psychoanalytic understanding of psychological development. Freud argued that sexual impulses exist from birth and undergo complex transformations through various developmental stages before reaching mature genital organization in adulthood. Problems during any stage of psychosexual development could create fixations that influence adult sexual functioning and personality characteristics. His theories about homosexuality reflected the prejudices of his era, but also attempted to provide scientific explanations for sexual orientation that challenged prevailing moral condemnations. Freud generally viewed homosexuality as a developmental deviation resulting from problems during the Oedipal stage, though he opposed legal persecution and advocated for more tolerant social attitudes. The concept of bisexuality became increasingly important in Freud's understanding of human sexual development and the origins of neurotic conflicts. He believed that all individuals possess both masculine and feminine psychological characteristics, and that healthy development requires integration of these different aspects. Problems arise when cultural pressures force people to suppress one side of their bisexual nature, creating internal conflicts that can manifest as neurotic symptoms. This theory helped explain why both men and women could develop various forms of sexual dysfunction and relationship problems when their natural psychological complexity was denied or suppressed. Freud's ideas about female sexuality remained controversial and reflected many of the gender biases of his historical period. His concepts of penis envy and female masochism have been extensively criticized by feminist scholars who argue that these theories pathologize normal female psychology and ignore social factors that contribute to women's psychological difficulties. However, his basic insight that sexual conflicts play central roles in psychological development continues to influence contemporary understanding of human sexuality and mental health. Modern sex therapy and relationship counseling often draw on psychoanalytic insights about how unconscious conflicts and early experiences shape adult sexual functioning and intimate relationships. Group psychology and mass behavior represented important extensions of psychoanalytic theory beyond individual therapy into broader social phenomena. Freud observed that people behave differently in groups than they do as individuals, often showing increased emotionality, decreased rational thinking, and greater susceptibility to influence from charismatic leaders. He explained these phenomena through concepts of identification and regression, arguing that group membership reactivates primitive psychological processes from early childhood. Group members identify with the leader as an idealized father figure, while also identifying with each other as siblings competing for parental approval. This creates temporary fusion of individual identities into a collective psychological unit that operates according to primary process thinking rather than rational deliberation. Understanding group psychology became important for explaining various social phenomena, including religious movements, political rallies, and mass hysteria that seemed to defy rational explanation. These insights also had practical applications for understanding and managing group dynamics in therapeutic settings, educational institutions, and organizational contexts. However, Freud's group psychology theories reflected the elite perspective of his era and have been criticized for potentially justifying authoritarian approaches to social control rather than promoting democratic participation and individual autonomy. The clinical applications of psychoanalytic theory extended far beyond the treatment of classical neuroses to influence understanding of personality disorders, psychotic conditions, and various forms of psychological suffering. Character analysis became an important therapeutic approach for addressing pervasive personality patterns that create ongoing life difficulties rather than discrete symptoms. Working with narcissistic, borderline, and other personality disorders required modifications of classical technique to address the specific developmental arrests and defensive organizations that characterize these conditions. Psychoanalytic understanding of psychosis emphasized the role of massive regression and withdrawal of libidinal investment from external objects back into the self. This perspective influenced the development of more empathetic and less confrontational approaches to treating severely mentally ill patients. Child analysis emerged as a specialized field that applied psychoanalytic insights to understanding and treating psychological problems in young people. These applications demonstrated the flexibility and broad relevance of psychoanalytic concepts, while also revealing their limitations and the need for ongoing theoretical and technical development. Contemporary psychoanalytic practice continues to evolve as practitioners integrate new research findings and address criticisms while maintaining core insights about unconscious motivation and the importance of early relationships in psychological development. Part 15. Legacy, Evolution and Modern Relevance. Freud's intellectual legacy extends far beyond the field of psychology to influence literature, art, anthropology, sociology, and popular culture in ways that continue to shape how people understand themselves and their relationships. His core insights about unconscious motivation, the importance of early childhood experiences, and the role of sexuality in psychological development have become so thoroughly integrated into modern thinking that many people accept these ideas without realizing their Freudian origins. However, many specific aspects of his theories have been challenged, modified or rejected by subsequent research and clinical experience. The evolution of psychoanalytic theory demonstrates both the enduring value of Freud's fundamental insights and the need for ongoing revision and development based on new evidence and changing social conditions. Understanding this legacy requires examining both the aspects of Freudian theory that remain influential and those that have been superseded by more contemporary approaches to understanding human psychology and mental health. The tension between honoring Freud's groundbreaking contributions and moving beyond his limitations continues to shape debates within psychology and related fields. Freud's ideas evolved significantly throughout his long career, as he continuously revised his theories based on new clinical observations and theoretical insights. His early focus on actual sexual trauma as the cause of neurosis gave way to greater emphasis on fantasy and unconscious conflict, when he realized that many patients' reported memories might not be historically accurate. The shift from a purely topographical model of mind, based on conscious and unconscious levels, to the structural model involving ID, ego and superego, reflected his growing understanding of psychological conflict and development. His initial emphasis on sexual drives gradually expanded to include aggressive drives and eventually the life and death drive theory that encompassed broader existential themes. These theoretical evolutions demonstrate Freud's intellectual honesty and willingness to modify his ideas when clinical evidence suggested that earlier formulations were incomplete or incorrect. However, some critics argue that his theoretical changes sometimes reflected personal biases or social pressures rather than objective scientific considerations. The ongoing development of psychoanalytic theory after Freud's death has continued this process of revision and refinement while maintaining core insights about unconscious psychological processes. Understanding how Freudian theory has evolved helps appreciate both its flexibility and its limitations as a framework for understanding human psychology. The scientific status of psychoanalytic theory remains controversial, with critics arguing that many Freudian concepts cannot be tested empirically and therefore lack scientific validity. Karl Popper famously criticized psychoanalysis for being unfalsifiable, meaning that its predictions are so flexible that they cannot be definitively proven wrong through experimental testing. Other critics have pointed out that many psychoanalytic concepts were based on small numbers of cases and may not generalize to broader populations. The lack of controlled studies demonstrating the effectiveness of psychoanalytic treatment compared to other therapeutic approaches has also raised questions about its clinical utility. However, defenders of psychoanalysis argue that its subject matter involves complex psychological phenomena that cannot be adequately studied through simple experimental designs. They contend that the rich clinical observations and detailed case studies provide valid forms of evidence that complement but cannot be replaced by quantitative research methods. Recent developments in neuroscience and attachment research have provided some empirical support for certain psychoanalytic concepts while challenging others. The debate about psychoanalysis's scientific status reflects broader questions about appropriate methods for studying human psychology and the relationship between clinical practice and empirical research. Feminist critics have extensively challenged Freudian theories about female psychology, arguing that concepts like penis envy and female masochism reflect patriarchal biases rather than scientific observations. These critics point out that Freud's theories were developed primarily through work with male patients and theoretical speculation rather than systematic study of women's psychological development. They argue that attributing women's psychological problems to anatomical inferiority or inadequate psychosexual development ignores the social and cultural factors that contribute to gender differences in mental health. Many feminist scholars have developed alternative theories that emphasize women's relational strengths and the importance of social context in understanding psychological development. However, some feminist psychoanalysts have worked to revise rather than reject Freudian theory, developing new approaches that maintain insights about unconscious processes while eliminating gender-biased assumptions. These efforts have led to more sophisticated understanding of how gender identity develops and how social power dynamics influence psychological experience. The feminist critique of psychoanalysis has contributed to broader recognition of how cultural biases can influence scientific theories and the importance of including diverse perspectives in psychological research. Contemporary psychoanalytic theory has largely abandoned the most problematic aspects of Freud's gender theories while maintaining core insights about psychological development and unconscious motivation. Cultural and cross-cultural critics have pointed out that many Freudian concepts reflect specifically Western and middle-class assumptions that may not apply to people from different cultural backgrounds. The emphasis on individual psychological development and nuclear family dynamics may not accurately describe societies with different family structures and values. Concepts like the Oedipus complex might not be relevant in cultures where children are raised by extended families or where gender roles differ significantly from early 20th century European patterns. Critics have also argued that psychoanalytic theories' focus on internal psychological conflicts might neglect the importance of social and economic factors in creating psychological distress. However, psychoanalytic concepts have been successfully adapted and applied in many different cultural contexts, suggesting that some insights about unconscious processes and psychological development may have broader applicability. Contemporary psychoanalytic theorists have increasingly recognized the importance of cultural factors and worked to develop more culturally sensitive approaches to understanding and treating psychological problems. The challenge involves distinguishing between universal aspects of human psychology that transcend cultural boundaries and culture-specific phenomena that require different theoretical frameworks. This ongoing work has enriched psychoanalytic theory, while also contributing to broader understanding of how culture influences psychological development and mental health. Modern neuroscience research has provided mixed support for Freudian concepts, with some findings confirming basic insights while challenging specific theoretical details. Brain imaging studies have demonstrated that much mental processing occurs outside conscious awareness, supporting the general concept of unconscious psychological activity. Research on memory and trauma has confirmed that difficult experiences can be repressed or dissociated in ways that influence behavior without conscious recollection. Studies of attachment and early brain development have validated the importance of early childhood relationships in shaping personality and mental health. However, neuroscience has not found evidence for many specific Freudian concepts like the Oedipus complex or particular stages of psychosexual development. The relationship between brain activity and psychological experience appears to be more complex and less directly causal than early psychoanalytic theories suggested. Despite these mixed findings, many neuroscientists acknowledge that Freudian insights about the importance of unconscious processes and early experiences anticipated discoveries that would not be confirmed through brain research until decades after his death. The integration of neuroscience and psychoanalytic perspectives continues to evolve as both fields develop more sophisticated understanding of how biological and psychological factors interact in human development and mental illness. Contemporary therapeutic approaches have been significantly influenced by psychoanalytic insights, even when they reject specific Freudian techniques or theories. The importance of the therapeutic relationship, attention to unconscious processes, and focus on early experiences appear across many different forms of psychotherapy. Cognitive behavioral therapy incorporates psychoanalytic insights about unconscious thought patterns while using more structured and empirically supported intervention techniques. Humanistic approaches like client-centered therapy adopt psychoanalytic emphasis on the importance of the therapeutic relationship, while rejecting interpretive techniques in favor of empathetic understanding. Family therapy and systems approaches build on psychoanalytic insights about how early relationships influence personality development while focusing on current family dynamics rather than individual intrapsychic conflicts. Even brief therapy approaches often incorporate modified psychoanalytic concepts about transference and resistance while adapting them to shorter treatment formats. This widespread influence demonstrates the enduring value of core psychoanalytic insights, while also showing how these ideas can be separated from specific theoretical commitments that may be outdated or incorrect. The continued evolution of psychotherapy reflects ongoing efforts to maintain valuable insights from psychoanalytic tradition while incorporating new research findings and addressing contemporary clinical challenges. The influence of Freudian ideas on popular culture has been enormous and continues to shape how people think about psychology, relationships, and human motivation in everyday life. Terms like unconscious, repression, Freudian slip, and defense mechanism have entered common language and are used routinely by people who may know little about formal psychoanalytic theory. Literature, film and television frequently employ psychoanalytic themes and concepts to explore character motivation and psychological conflict. The emphasis on childhood experiences as formative influences on adult personality has become widely accepted in popular culture and parenting advice. However, popular understanding of Freudian concepts often involves oversimplification or misinterpretation that differs significantly from sophisticated psychoanalytic theory. The widespread cultural influence of these ideas demonstrates their intuitive appeal and explanatory power, while also showing how scientific concepts can be transformed through popular transmission. Understanding the relationship between formal psychoanalytic theory and its popular cultural expressions helps clarify both the strengths and limitations of Freudian insights. The continuing presence of psychoanalytic themes in contemporary culture suggests that these ideas address fundamental questions about human nature that remain relevant regardless of specific theoretical controversies. The future relevance of Freudian insights depends partly on continued integration with other approaches to understanding human psychology and mental health. Developments in genetics, neuroscience, and social psychology provide new perspectives on topics that Freud explored through clinical observation and theoretical speculation. Rather than viewing these different approaches as competing alternatives, contemporary scholars increasingly recognize their potential complementary contributions to comprehensive understanding of human psychology. Biological research illuminates the neural mechanisms underlying psychological processes, while psychoanalytic insights help explain the subjective meaning and developmental origins of these phenomena. Social research examines how cultural and interpersonal factors influence psychological development, while psychoanalytic theory explores how these external influences become internalized as psychological structures. The integration of these different levels of analysis promises richer understanding of human psychology than any single approach could provide. However, successful integration requires careful attention to both the strengths and limitations of each perspective and ongoing dialogue between researchers and practitioners from different theoretical traditions. The ultimate value of Freudian insights will depend on their ability to contribute to this broader enterprise of understanding and helping human psychological experience in all its complexity and diversity.